Well, I've been crocheting and knitting and sewing ever since I was a little kid. I love doing everything crafty. And this particular craft is so exciting to me because I am especially fond of taking something that might end up in a landfill and making something really cool with it. So I'm going to be teaching you guys how to make the plarn, and then I'm also going to be teaching you guys how to make this tote. This is the crochet version of the bags that we're going to be learning today.
All right, and then next, of course, we have Jen Lucas with us. Jen, a little intro on you and what it is that we're doing with you today.
Yeah, thanks, Leah. Thanks for having me. I'm so excited to be here with Brenda today. This is our first time both being together live. But I've been knitting for about 20 years, crocheting for maybe about 15. And this was my first time ever working with plastic yarn, the Plarn. And so I'm really excited to show you all the steps you need to make the knitted version of the bag.
So what is plarn? Here's a ball of plarn that I made. Plarn just means plastic yarn, is basically putting those two words together, calling it a plarn. And it's just a way of cutting up ordinary plastic bags into loops and then linking them together to make a long strand, right? So you can crochet with it or knit with it or do other crafts that you would use yarn for. So I'm going to be showing you my version, the way that I like to make the plarn. There's a couple of other versions that I've seen, but this one seemed to work the best it was easy to use, it was easy to put the plarn pieces together, and it was also easy to work with for when I crocheted the bag. So that's why this is my favorite method. And inside my Earth Day tote pattern, there is a description on how to make the plarn, which is the way that I'm going to be teaching you in a minute here. But there's also a little list of, if you take a look here on page 3, there's a list of different thicknesses of the plastic bags and about how wide to cut them. I noticed most of the plarn tutorials that I looked at before I started this had you cut your strips into 1-inch strips, but I noticed that when you use a very thin produce bag like this compared to a thicker bag, I know you can't feel through the monitor, but maybe you can hear the difference, you know, that they would make a thicker yarn and a thinner yarn, and if you're using all these different bags, you really have no control over it getting thicker and thinner like that, unless you cut them into different width strips. So what you do is you just take any bag that you have. This one, I'm going to show with this first because it has pleats in it. And honestly, before this project, I never really noticed the construction of plastic bags before, but now I know a lot about how plastic bags are put together.
Same. I was the same way. I had no idea they had pleats in them until now.
There's a pleat here. Who knew? Okay, so you just want to flatten your bag out. If it has pleats, you just kind of find those pleats and poke it into the right spot. And then you're going to just fold it a few times. And really, you don't have to be, you know, this doesn't have to be a certain width or anything. You just want it to be narrow enough that you can easily snip through it with a pair of scissors because you're going to be making a lot of these. For my bag, it took between 180 bags. So yeah, you have to find a quick way to make all these loops, right? Otherwise, it's just going to take you a super long time. Here, I'll put this behind so you can see a little better what I'm doing. This white bag. All right, so you roll up your bag, and then you're going to snip off the end where the seam in the bottom of the bag is because that is not useful. It's not going to make a loop. And then you're going to recycle that. And then because this bag is a little thicker, I'm going to be cutting it at about 3/4 of an inch up to an inch. You can just eyeball it. You don't have to be super careful. It's okay if these are not perfect. So you're just going to slice the whole thing up like this. And then when you get to the handles, you can't use that part either, so you have to recycle that. So then you have all these lovely little loops. If you open them up, it's a circle. Okay, I'm going to do that one more time with these so you can see. I'm going to use 2 different colors so it'll be easier to see me linking the bags together. These are newspaper bags. I was lucky enough to have someone donate their newspaper bags to me to this project. And when I was cutting these up, because they're so thin, I stacked 3 at a time and just tried to even out the ends. You can certainly do this 1 at a time. That's okay too. Roll it up to where it's a manageable size to snip through. I'm going to cut off all the ends that are seamed or melted together. And actually for this bag, I should have cut that a little wider. Actually, we can still use that. This bag is a little thinner than the last bag that I cut, so I'm going to cut it a little bit wider. So this should be maybe like 1.5 inches, maybe even 2 inches. This is the kind of thing you just have to kind of play with, and as you make a lot of these, you'll start to learn about the different thicknesses of the bags and about how wide you want to cut them. But I do have a guide in the pattern so that you can have a place to start. All right, so see, these are much smaller because it's just a newspaper bag. And although they were wide, they're going to crunch down to about the same size as one of these loops. All right, so to link these together, you will lay them both down and place one on top of the other. Then you're going to reach through the one that's on top, so that's the orange one. You're reaching through there, and you're going to grab the orange from underneath this white one. So you're kind of like sneaking up underneath, and you're going to grab hold of that and pull it through. Pull everything through together. And see how that just linked it together, made a nice little knot. We'll do that a couple more times. I'll switch colors so you can see. So another thing, if you don't want to work at a table, if you just want to be working in a chair, you can just hold this. You don't have to put it flat on the table if you don't want to. And if you have a very long loop here, what I like to do to make sure the sides are even, because when you put the next knot in, if you put the next knot here, you're going to have this part sticking out. You have to put the knot opposite where this knot is, so you have the equal amount there. If it's a little off, it's okay. It's not the end of the world, but it does help you if you can get it right opposite of that. So you can hold this with one hand close to where the folded edges that's opposite of the knot. Lay this one on top, the new one on top. Reach through the new one underneath the old one and grab the new one and pull through. Like that. So you just keep linking and linking and linking. And then eventually you'll have a whole bunch of it and you can just ball it up. See? And one thing about making the Plarn that I didn't think about until I started working on this is that you might have a bunch of different colors. You might only have like a couple of colors. You can think ahead of time about how you'd like to use the different colors. If you want to do stripes, like thicker stripes, like in our bags that we made, Jen also did this. You would take your bags and sort them at the beginning, put all the gray bags in one pile, all the white bags in another pile, and then make those into strips all together and then move on to the next color. Or if you want to make something that's like a little more speckly looking, then you can just cut up all your bags, or you can do it in stages, cut up a bunch of bags all at once, dump it in a bowl or bucket or something like that, and then mix them all up and then strand them together randomly or however you see fit. So that is the difference between how the color pattern is on this bag and on this bag.
What's interesting about the way you cut the bags is, so when you were doing this at home, did you roll up or like fold up all the bags and cut each individual bag?
I did. How did you do it?
So I took my cutting mat and I put the bags flat and tucked in those pleats we didn't know existed until this last week. And then I used a rotary cutter and a ruler and just stacked a few on top of each other and then did my strips that way.
That's a great way to do it fast.
But I ended up with the loops and then passing them through the same way like you did. But that's interesting.
Okay.
Yeah, cool.
Cool. So just to give you guys a little bit of an overview on this bag, I began the bag. If we look at the bottom here, there's just a rectangle that I made back and forth and back and forth. And then at the end of the base of the bag, when I finished that, then I started working around the edges of my rectangle. And I went around and around and around up to the top. It's very simple, single crochet, and then we'll get into the handles later. But because everybody's going to have a different amount of bags. Maybe you want to make a different size bag. I'll just be talking about that a little bit too as we go. Here's my little baby bag, you guys. I made this first sample so that I could show you guys how the handle's attached, but I also want to point out that you can take this pattern and you can make it into a different size if you like. So when we begin this bag, we're going to make the rectangle for the bottom, and I'm going to be working on making like a mini bag like this in this tutorial, but just know that all the instructions in your pattern are actually inside for this larger bag here. So you're going to start with a slip knot. Put that on your hook. And when you're working with Plarn, I don't know how it is for knitting, but because I haven't done that yet, but for crocheting, I need to pull up my loops a little bit more and work a little more loosely than I normally would with the hook that I have. I mean, I still want to create a dense fabric, so I am crocheting, you know, a fairly solid fabric, but I'm pulling up just a little bit more because this is stickier than yarn, and so you need to be able to get your hooks back into your stitches.
Yeah, it was the same thing with the knitting. It's weird because it's like the bag is stretchy kind of, but when you're working with the Plarn, it's not that stretchy.
Yeah, there's not a lot of give here.
Yeah.
Not like crocheting or knitting with yarn. All right, so I'm gonna just chain 8 stitches. You're gonna be doing more than that if you're making the full size bag. 1, 2, 3. So see, as I pull my loops, I'm actually pulling up right now to make that loop just a little bit longer. Pulling up just a little bit, so it'll be a little easier for me to work into later. All right, so we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and one more for a turning chain. So this is going to be the dimension here that goes in this direction. Here, I'll hold it like this so you can see this is going to be there. So when you first do your first foundation chain, it's going to be however wide you want the bottom of your bag to be. All right, so we have that extra turning chain. We're going to skip that. And I always like to work into the bottom bump of my chain. It's just a little easier. So instead of working underneath the V on the top, I flip it over and work underneath that bump on the bottom. So this first row can be a little bit tricky, as you know, just in regular crochet. And working with the Plarn, it can be even just a little bit trickier because it can be a little sticky. So, whoops, let me back up and talk about what I'm actually doing here. These are single crochet stitches. Okay, so we're gonna insert our hook underneath that bottom bump, yarn over, pull up a loop. Now we have 2 loops on the hook, yarn over, pull through 2. There's our first single crochet. We're gonna single crochet all the way across into each of those bottom bumps. So insert, pull up a loop, yarn over, pull through 2. Insert, pull up a loop, yarn over, pull through 2. And then you can kind of adjust your fabric. It's very malleable, strangely, but you can kind of just stretch it out a little bit. As you're crocheting, it can look a little curly. See how I'm just sort of pulling it into the right shape so I can see where my stitches are. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and one more, 7. So I can't remember for sure, but in the pattern, I'm pretty sure it's 14 stitches across instead of the 7 that I'm doing to make the full-size bag. Then when you get to the end, you're gonna chain 1. And sometimes you'll find yourself with kind of a lumpy knot like what I have here, and you can try to make it a little tighter, a little smaller, but sometimes you just have to decide if that knot is gonna go through the loop or stay in front of the loop. You'll see when you're working on this, it's okay either way. It'll all straighten itself out later, but you might have a little extra adjusting to do. All right, so I pulled through, did my 1 chain. Now I'm gonna turn to work in the opposite direction, and I'm gonna do single crochet in each of my stitches. So insert, yarn over, pull up a loop. See, I'm pulling up just a little more on these loops than I normally would. Yarn over, pull through 2. Pulling up on that loop just a little more than I normally would. Insert, pull up a loop, yarn over, pull through 2.
So I have a question for you. So for your hook size, is this like the hook size you would normally use for, I don't, what would you call this, a bulky weight yarn? I don't know.
Yeah, I would say this is kind of a chunky, bulky weight yarn. Yeah, I mean, maybe when you crunch it all down, it's like if I twist it, it's like very skinny.
Thin, yeah.
But it's so sticky, it just,
Yeah.
and it kind of fluffs up and untwists as you crochet it, so.
Yeah, I found I had to use a bigger knitting needle than I thought I was going to for this.
Me too.
Okay.
I started with a G hook and now I'm using an I hook. The I hook is what I suggest to use in the pattern, but for getting the right gauge, you just need to use whatever hook you need to get a fabric that you like, something that's stiff enough and you know, will feel like a structured bag for this project. But you know, you probably will need to use a slightly larger hook than what you were first imagining you would use, just because it helps to get those loops a little taller. Yeah, and it's just sticky. The plastic is just kind of
sticky. Yeah.
All right, so I've reached the opposite end of my row. I just did all single crochets all the way across. Then you would turn, chain and turn and work across, and you'll go back and forth until you get the size of the bottom of your bag. So for me, for this little itty bitty bag, I did 14 rows of 7 stitches, just in case you want to make a tiny one like me. Let's see. All right, so this is the bottom of my little bag. And it might look a little smaller than this, but that's because there's one more round. There's a round that I'm going to do around the edges of this. So in order to work around into our row ends, I get a lot of questions about working into row ends because it's not very, usually in crochet you can kind of tell, you know, the pattern will tell you, okay, work into the next stitch or work around the post of the next stitch or whatever. But sometimes it says working into your row ends and you're like, where do I put my hook for that? That's confusing. So you can just put it wherever it looks good. So for this pattern, you're gonna put a stitch marker somewhere in the middle to help you divide up your sections so you can get them to be evenly spaced. So I'm gonna do 7 stitches here and 7 stitches here. On the actual large size bag, I believe it's 14 and 14. And if you wanna divide that even further, you can. Whatever you need to keep you kind of on track to spread out your stitches evenly. So I've already chained 1, and then I'm going to just start working along these row ends here. So I'm going to insert my hook, and we're just doing single crochets, and I'm doing 7 before the stitch marker. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. All right. So I worked my 7, and I'm going to do 7 more here. And when you are, you know, working with regular yarn, you're going to want to work into the tightest point, but you know, with this Plarn, you can't really move it around too much because it's very sticky. So you just take whatever you can get. When we're doing 7, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Sometimes your hook will kind of get stuck in the loop and you just have to move it over, like what happened to me there. This is a particularly sticky bag. This is a bread bag. 6, 7, which you can totally use, but it does have a stickier texture and it doesn't want to slide on your hook as much. So if you think you might get frustrated with the stickiness, maybe avoid the bread bags and use some of the smoother bags like this one. Then when you get to the opposite, the foundation chain, the opposite from where you began, you're going to put extra stitches in this corner. I believe you put 3. Let's see. Yeah, 3 stitches here. 1, 2, 3 in that first stitch, and then you're going to crochet across and put 3 in the opposite. So we're going to crochet 1 stitch in each of the next however many stitches you have until there's 1 left on your foundation chain. And all of these, the directions are very specific in the pattern, so you don't have to just guess. I'm just doing this because I'm making a smaller sample so we can get a little further in the project. So I've made it to my last stitch there, and I'm gonna do 3 stitches in there. 1, 2, 3. And this just helps you turn the corner a little bit, putting those extra stitches. And then you're going to continue across here doing the same amount of stitches as you had on the first side. So you divide it in the middle with your stitch marker to keep you on track, and then do 7 stitches. There we go. Before the stitch marker, 7 stitches after, or if you're making the full-size bag, 14 and 14. And then you'll come across to the last row that you worked, and you'll do the 3 stitches, crochet all the way across, and 3 stitches in the last stitch of that last row. So you have 3 stitches here, single crochet, 1 in each stitch, and 3 stitches on the corner. Then when you get that far, you're just gonna start single crocheting and single crocheting and single crocheting, 1 in each stitch all the way around. And you will have a piece that looks like this. So let me just show you. We've worked back and forth in our turned rows here. Then we did 1 round working into those row ends, putting 3 stitches in each corner basically. And then after that, we're just gonna continue single crocheting around and around and around. You don't have to do any joins, which means you don't slip stitch. You just continue around and around and around until you're at the height of wherever you want to stop, or wherever you run out of bags.
So I have a question. So while I was knitting my bag, sometimes I would aggressively pull on my plarn and break one side of it.
Okay.
Now I would just tie it in a knot and keep going. Did you have that problem at all?
It didn't happen to me it happened a few times, yes. And that can, especially because you're dealing with the little knots between your pieces, you can't, it might snap. And just depending on the plastic bag, it seemed like some of them broke more than others. It just was the type of bag. So yeah, I would just tie it in a knot and keep going. Or you can undo, if you don't want to deal with that little end, which, you could just tie in a knot and leave it there.
That's what I did.
Or you could weave it in. It doesn't really, if you look at the inside, I have you can see like there's little bitty knots and little pieces sticking out. Oh, there's one. See, it's not perfect, but you can kind of poke those things to the inside, and it's so sticky, it just seems like it wants to stay, and you don't have to worry as much on regular yarn to weave in your ends as much.
I did the exact same thing too. Yeah. I just poked any little knots to the inside.
Poke them in there.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it looks a little smoother on the outside, but yeah, I just tie it in a knot, or you can actually take your plarn apart. If you don't pull these super tight and you have 2 different colors, you can reach in here and take your plarn apart and pull out, the offending plarn piece or whatever. You can pull it apart, and then you can hook it to a different piece so you don't have any ends to weave in. Like, let's see. Let me just do this. So like, say you wanted to join another ball and you didn't want to deal with weaving in ends. Oh, let's see if I can actually get this apart. I think I might have tied this knot kind of tight. There we go. There's the end. You just pull them apart. And then if you wanted to join these 2 balls together and you didn't want to have like an end sticking out, you can just, like how we were joining our plarn earlier, you can lay one on top of the other. And then whichever one is on top, so the orange is on top, you can reach through and grab the orange ball and pull it through here. Ta-da, they're linked. Now it's 1 ball of yarn. So now you have to just
wind it all
do this until it's all on one side. So, you can actually add things as you go, which is kind of fun because you can't do that with a regular.
Right.
You can sort of felt it together, but you can't really magically put your yarn together. So then you just finish up with whatever height you have in the pattern. I do tell you how many rows I had, and you'll know the height of the bag, so you can stop at that point or wherever you feel like stopping, whatever size you want. And then you can work on the handles. So the handles, I made the handles on my bag just for fun, and because it was a smaller amount and I knew I had enough bags, I made them out of a solid color so you could see them a little bit better. I just used brown, and I'm going to do that on the little mini bag too. So, and then just to explain, I actually am making these handles half as long as they are in the pattern so that they go with my little tiny bag. So in the original large size bag, it was, you chain 61 to begin, and for the little bag, you'll chain 31, and then you begin. This is just like how we had worked this piece before, single crochet, working in the bottom bump. You'll chain the amount you need, you'll have one for a turning chain, and then you're gonna work single crochet all the way across that first row. So I'm almost finished with that part. I'm gonna swap out and put my hook in here. And then continue working my single crochets into that bottom bump. Can you guys hear the sound of my yarn? Crinkle, crinkle. This is a crinkly bag.
It's a very loud project.
It has something to say here. It's talking to me.
Yeah.
All right, so I've made my single crochets all the way across to the end. Then I'm going to chain one just to help me get around to the opposite side of the foundation chain, because we're not going to flip this over. We're not turning it this way. We are just going to be working around in a circle like this to do the handle. So we've reached the end, the end, chained one. Then we're going to rotate our work, and now we're going to work into the opposite side of that foundation chain, okay? So we're going to start by doing 2 single crochets in the first stitch. 1, 2. This helps it have a nice curved edge. And then 2 single crochets in the next stitch. 1, 2. And I'm going to place a stitch marker in that first stitch of this round here. And then we're going to single crochet across. I'm going to work all the way across.
So you're actually, it's like you're working in the round because you're coming around that other side.
Exactly.
Okay, gotcha.
It's like a sneaky way to work in the round where you start out pretending like you're going to work in rows. And you fake everyone out, and then you switch it up, and you're just you're working it in the round. It's basically, you know, you probably have seen people working around and around in the circles, but this just starts out with a chain instead of just a loop in the middle. So we'll get across to the opposite side, and then we'll do a couple extra single crochets on that end too.
Yeah, I love how you did the handles on here where they're like separate and you attach them like on the front. I think it looks so cool.
Thank you. Yeah, I wasn't really sure if I wanted them to just sort of grow out. Did you just continue knitting on yours?
Yeah, mine,
Maybe
yes.
we're jumping ahead. Sneak preview,
Yeah,
guys.
sneak peek. I did like bind off and leave stitches on each side to make the handle, and then I attached them together at
all
the top.
Continuous, yeah. That was one thing that I was thinking about doing, just stitching into it, but I wasn't sure. I just wasn't sure either way. And then when I decided to do it out of a solid color, I was like, okay, I guess I have to sew those on. But then I wasn't really sure if that was going to be strong enough, because I thought it might have been better to just do what you did and just continue stitching into it instead of sewing it. And I was like, okay, I better make sure that this is going to be plenty strong, because if I'm going to take a picture of this bag with all these groceries in it, and somebody makes it and they pick it up and break their bag, they're going to be like, Brenda,
Yeah.
So you know how Jen, when you were a professional and you make patterns for a living, you know how you set aside the project that you made and you don't use it, and you're supposed to be all good about it until it's like, for sure you'll never need it again, and then you can use it.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I totally broke my rule. Like, I was using this at the grocery store because
you had to test it out.
I know. I didn't want to be like pretending you could carry all this stuff, and then really you couldn't. Okay, so I made my single crochets go all the way across to the end except for the last 2 stitches, and those 2 stitches each get 2 single crochets. 1, 2, then 1, 2. Okay, and then there was a little turning chain there, so we're skipping over that turning chain. It's kind of getting lost in here. And then you're going to do 2 more single crochets and 2 more single crochets. the pattern will remind you to skip that turning chain. That just was only a turning chain and never counted as a stitch, poor thing. We're just gonna ignore it like it never existed. All right, so I'm doing, basically you have 4 single crochets where you put 2 single crochets in each stitch on, around the ends. So that's what gives you, that's what allows it to curve around so you have enough length here to get all the way around. Then you'll just continue single crocheting all the way across this side until you get to 2 stitches before the end, and you'll do 2 stitches, 2 stitches. So let me show you what that looks like. Here we have crocheted across to the end, almost to the end, I should say. And then we have 2 stitches in the second to last stitch of our round. 1, 2, and then 2 stitches into the next. 1, 2. And then we are going to just fasten off. So we'll just slip stitch, and then we'll yarn over and pull through and just fasten off like that. And if you leave this long enough, you can use that to help stitch your handle onto the bag. All right, so then you're going to place a stitch marker in the 8th stitch from the end, the 8th to the last stitch, and that doesn't include that last fastening off slip stitch business. You're just going to ignore that. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. There's my stitch marker. In the 8, you just count 8 backwards. Put your stitch marker in the 8th of those stitches. And then you are going to begin working that, well, on my bag, it's the little orange decorative part that I added on. So this not only is kind of a cute decoration, but also it helps form the roundness of the handles, and it also helps the handle not stretch out so much. So it's got a lot of, it's got a lot resting on its shoulders, this poor little orange guy. Okay, so we're gonna start, whoops, let's see, where did, oh, I already took my stitch marker out because I was so excited. All right, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. All right, and we're just going to pull up a loop of the new color in that 8th stitch and leave this, actually I'm gonna leave that a little longer so that we have plenty to use to sew to the bag. So we'll pull up a loop in that 8th one, and we're going to stitch around 14, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And remember how we put that slip stitch into a stitch at the end? We can stitch right into that slip stitch and ignore the stitch that it was stitched into, if that makes sense. Basically, you want to have the equivalent of 1 stitch for the stitch that the slip stitch was stitched into. Did you get that?
Yeah, I think so.
You don't want to add any stitches here. You don't want to subtract any stitches here. You're just having the same amount as you had before. But you know what? Let me tell you a little secret. It doesn't really matter. Honestly, you could put an extra slip stitch in there or a fewer, like 1 fewer stitch, and it would not matter. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Okay. And then I need to do 1 more stitch. Okay, so we have 14 slip stitches around. And then this next stitch, instead of stitching into that, we are going to fold our handle like this. We're going to fold it the long way. Here, let's pull that orange tail out so that's out of the way. And we are going to insert our hook into the next stitch that we would have slip stitched into, and it's going to go out the first place we picked up our yarn. So that it actually should have a stitch marker in it. I told you to leave a stitch marker in it, and I did not listen to myself, but there is a stitch marker in there if you follow my pattern.
Yeah.
There will be one. So you're gonna go through here and through there. And what we're doing is just a slip stitch, but we're using it, so we yarn over, pull it through, and pull through that loop. We're just going to use that to seam this together into kind of a rolled shape, like that.
That's so clever.
Thank
Where
you.
it's like flat when you're sewing it on, but that the handle
Right.
itself is like,
Exactly, and it has like a little bit of an extra sturdiness
Yeah.
to it because it's made into a rounded shape. And this slip stitching that I'm doing right now, it really keeps it from stretching out. You can see, like, I really can't even hardly stretch that anymore, but I can stretch this.
yeah.
So, you know, because I was imagining myself all fancy pants at the grocery store shopping with my special Plarn tote, I was like, I am not going to be in the store and have this thing fall apart on me. So I want to make sure my handle is very secure.
Brenda, while you're showing these slip stitches, can you talk about what size hook you are using to crochet? Lisa's curious about that.
Yes. So this is an eye hook. Let's see, 5.5 millimeters. I, for some reason, can never seem to remember the millimeters and the letters and the numbers. I have to look every time. Every time. So yes, it's an eye hook, and this is working great for me for this project. But you will just need whatever size hook you know it makes a good fabric and gets your piece to be about the right size. You can check your gauge against my gauge. If your square ends up being bigger than mine, then you should think about whether your fabric is kind of loose and it's going to need to have a smaller hook in order to make a sturdy enough fabric. But one other tip that I have about the hook is that I really prefer using a metal hook for this project because it's kind of, you sort of have to pull on this, you know, it's a little sticky and it takes a little oomph to get your stitches in the right spot. So I definitely recommend using a metal hook, and because it can be kind of hard on your hands, I also recommend something with like a little extra padding if you have it. It's really helping me out. Like, I think my hand, I would have to take a lot more breaks in order to make this bag if I didn't have that extra padding on the hook.
And
so,
no,
go ahead.
The thing you were saying too about like finding the hook size that works for you and your gauge, because you can just add more Plarn on, like, yeah, maybe you used 80 to 100 bags, but if your gauge is a little different, you could just add more bags on if you needed to. It's so easy.
Yeah, you could just definitely, I mean, there's so many bags out there in the world that need to be made into something awesome, you guys. So.
Yeah.
All right, so then you'll stitch across your required number of slip stitches that it says in the pattern. I'm gonna do, yeah, I think that'll be good for mine. And then you are going to just stop stitching through both layers, and you're only going to stitch into the one layer to finish that up. So I'm only working through that layer on top, just doing a little decorative line here in my pretty orange newspaper bag.
We've got another question that's come in that maybe you can talk about a little, both of you actually. This is from Crazy Maisie, and it looks like Crazy Maisie is watching in the UK. The bags that they have in the UK that they would be using to make the Plarn are made to break down after a period of time, and sometimes that's quite quick. So I would imagine that these bags would only last as long as the Plarn. So do you have any ideas about the different timing, maybe specific to the United States plastic bags versus UK? Are there bags to avoid? I'm imagining like compostable bags or biodegradable bags. Here in the US, we have them marked separately. What do you have to say about stuff like that?
Yeah, I did come across some of those bags that were marked like biodegradable on them, which is awesome, but I wouldn't use them for this project.
Right,
I mean, I think, you know, you're gonna spend a lot of time making this, and then eventually it's just gonna break down, and it's gonna be disappointing. But, you know, if you are interested in repurposing things, you can make yarn out of old t-shirts or something like that instead. And use that instead, because it's just, you know, I mean, I guess it's up to you. If you could do a little sample and see how long they last, maybe if it doesn't get, like, I don't know if it breaks down faster if it's buried or gets
I'm
wet.
not
I have no
actually
idea.
sure.
We are not, we are not trained in plastic bags except for crocheting and knitting with them. But I don't know. That is a good question though.
maybe if anybody watching has a little more knowledge about something like this, you can drop that into the chat as well. We can crowdsource a little bit on this topic.
Yeah, that's a good idea. Okay, so I have already finished slip stitching around the edge, and then you will take your pieces and put them onto your bag wherever you want them to be. I kind of aim for them for the part where it's stitched together into a cord being like along the top edge of the bag, but wherever it makes sense. And then you're just going to seam it. So seam it through the bag. So when you do this, you know, if you're using actual real yarn, you can split through your fibers and that helps hold it better. That means, you know, you actually use your needle to go to split through each yarn. But I would not recommend doing that with the Plarn because I think it's just going to make it weaker at that point. So you just have to kind of send it through. Sometimes you have to wiggle it around to get it in the right spot because you can, like right now, I'm getting it stuck. I can feel it getting stuck. There we go. So I am using, of course, the orange yarn tail to be sewing this through, but you can certainly use any color that matches either of those. You could use the brown here too to sew through. And I'm just going right through in and out of the slip stitch, the decorative slip stitch area. But if you were using the brown, and actually this is the weakest point on your project where this is stitched on. The rest of this is all solid. So I would recommend, you know, getting pretty serious about stitching these handles on. They really need to be stitched on well. So I would go around this twice. So whether you do that, you know, 2 times with the orange if you have enough there, or if you just want to grab another piece of the matching brown and maybe you sew in through here. I think either way, it doesn't really matter, but I would definitely sew, I would say at least 2 times around. And you can do, you know, just in and out and in and out, or you can do a back stitch, which might be a little stronger. Here, I'll show you. Let's see. So come up through here. We're going to go back 1 stitch, like that. And then we'll come up through the next stitch, whoops, right there. And go through here. That'd be a little bit stronger probably because you're going over the area that you just stitched. And you'll just continue going all the way from here in this sort of U shape. And then you can do that again in the brown here and have your stitches kind of blend in.
Awesome.
And then you'll place the other handle. And then I think in the pattern, I recommend how far it is between handles, but you could just put them on wherever it makes sense. Maybe, you know, pin them on and try it on and see if it's in the spot that you want it to be in.
Cool.
So, and that's your bag.
Okay, great. So yeah, my bag is actually similar in construction to Brenda's. Brenda finished her bag first and I read through her pattern and I thought, okay, I can make my knit bag in a similar construction to that. So mine is started with a rectangle at the bottom and then we're gonna pick up stitches, work in the round, and then my handles are all attached and worked in one piece. So we're gonna bind off, leave some stitches, bind off, leave some stitches, and then 3 needle bind off at the end. So to start, we're gonna have our plarn and we're gonna cast on some stitches. So for this, the cast on doesn't really matter. Whatever one you wanna use is fine. I use the long tail cast on. The only one you want to avoid is the backwards loop, cursive E, whatever you want to call it, because we are going to be slip stitching or doing a slip stitch on the first stitch, then the backwards loop cast on doesn't really work for that. So I'm going to start with a slip knot and stick that on my needle I almost said hook because I've just been watching you crochet.
I have brainwashed you.
Yes, you've brainwashed me.
1 point for Team Crochet.
That's right. And I'm just going to use the long tail cast on to cast on 11 stitches total. So our slip knot did count as a stitch here. And just like what Brenda was saying, you just gotta kind of work around those knots. Sometimes you need to pull the knot through, sometimes you don't. You'll get a feel for it, like the crochet as you go. So let's see, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. But I need 11. 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. There we go. One more. All right.
Jen, did you find that you needed a certain type of needle? Like you were using wood needles or bamboo needles there?
Here for my demo, I'm using wood, but when I knit the entire bag, I actually did use a metal needle. I just didn't have enough metal needles to bring with me today. But yeah, so I do recommend a metal needle just like you, because you do end up kind of cranking on that needle like you do with the hook.
It's kind of sticky.
Yeah, it's sticky. So yeah, these needles are pretty strong. But yeah, for the whole bag, if you have a metal needle, I'd go with that. So for our bottom rectangle, we're just working in garter stitch back and forth in rows. And you may know garter stitch is kind of stretchy, and so that's why I am adding a slip stitch for the first stitch of every row so that it's a little bit sturdier and it can only stretch so far. So the first stitch of every row, we're going to slip one with the yarn or plarn in front. So we're going to slip one and then move our plarn to the back and then knit across. And so you'll do this the number of times indicated in the pattern. I think it's 73 times or 74. You're going to end up with 37 slip stitches on each side, but the pattern will tell you exactly what to do. So I'm just knitting across here. And then we'll look at that slip stitch one more time.
So did the slip stitch, that allows you, when you're going around the bag and picking up stitches around the edges, does that make that sturdier? Is that why?
Yeah,
Like,
and yeah,
it's not pulling on just like one little, like it's a thicker amount of yarn plarn.
Yes, it's a thicker amount to pick up in. It doesn't make the bottom stretch as much. And it's kind of when you were doing your crochet one and you were saying you just kind of stick the hook where you can get it, you have these slip stitches that you can actually pretty easily see even with the plarn, that then you can just pick up and knit in them. Yeah.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah. Because I started it and I'm like, how am I going to pick up stitches? And I was like, the slip stitch will help with this.
That's very clever of you, Jen.
Thank you. So let's just look at that again. So to slip with the yarn in front, we have our plarn to the front. We're just going to slip just like that and then move it in between the needles to the back and knit. And like I said before, I made my plarn the exact same way Brenda did. I just stacked the bags up flat and cut it with my rotary cutter, but it's with the loops linked together. It's the same way. So you would just keep working your rectangle until you have the right number of rows, which it says in the pattern, and then we're gonna pick up around our little rectangle. And so I just have like a wee little rectangle here. So we'll work one more row, slip one with the yarn in front, knit across. And then you'll have a longer circular needle for this. I have a pretty short one here. So I was able to just use that one long circular that it tells you in the pattern how long it should be to pick up the stitches. But if you are having a hard time with it, you can use a spare needle to help you pick up your stitches and get them on that circular needle. So now we're going to pick up along one edge here. So we basically are turning it 90 degrees and we have these slip stitches here. So they're the little V's of Plarn. There we go. There's another one. And so I'm just going to take my right needle, go in there and wrap the yarn around to pick up and knit the stitch. And you're just doing that all the way down. And here's where it's kind of an advantage that it's a little stretchy, because you can kind of just force your stitch in there, because I can kind of pull this and not have to worry about it breaking. And then when you get to your cast on edge, you're just going to do the same thing. The pattern will tell you exactly how many to pick up in the cast on edge, but you'll just do the same thing here. The other thing you can do, and again, it's going to depend on your length of needle and things like that, you can also take your left needle, pick up all these loops, and then knit across. So that's another option, or even I have a smaller needle here, that might even work better, because it'd be easier to get into these stitches. So if you pick them up with one needle, then you can just knit across here, like so. And don't knit with that Plarn tail.
I did that a few times.
Yeah,
with
same.
my crochet project.
Okay, so you would just keep working around. When you get to the other side, you'll just pick up the stitches in the same way, and then you'll be joined in the round. There will be a little bit of increasing, and I'll show you how to do that just on my little start over here. So you are going to have to increase a little bit once you've started working in the round, and the stitch I just used was a knit front and back because it's Plarn. It doesn't matter too much.
There's a lot of texture going on
Yeah,
there.
we don't need to worry about the type of increase we're using. So when you get to that point in the pattern to knit into the front and back, you're simply going to knit the stitch and then keep the stitch on the left needle, bring the right needle around to the back of that stitch and knit it again. So now I have 2 stitches where I previously had 1. So then you're just going to keep knitting around and around and around and around, and then we're going to do just a little bit of a garter stitch band up here, just so this wouldn't really curl. Although I don't know if Plarn would curl in stockinette stitch like regular yarn, but I think just habit told me to make a garter stitch band. Okay. So all you're going to do for your garter stitch band is you're just going to be basically knitting around, purling around, knitting around, purling around. So here I am finishing up a purl round. And so once you finish that garter stitch band, now we can start working on the handles. And so for the handles, we're going to be knitting now. And so we're going to knit the next 13 stitches. And then we'll start binding off. And see here, you can see I'm kind of coming to a knot. I always try to just push it to the inside of my project as much as possible.
I feel like too, when you're working with the Plarn, you just have to if you're the kind of person who, like me, wants everything to look like a perfect when you're done, even though obviously it's not always going to be that way. You just have to tell yourself this is a different kind of project.
Right.
You just have to let some things go, and you're not going to have a perfect amount of this color and a perfect amount of this color, and all your knots aren't going to just be perfect when you pull them together. You just have to let it go a little bit and just relax.
Right. I mean, we're trying to repurpose something. This is a very unusual material to be knitting and crochet with, so you just have to accept it that Yeah, this isn't going to be your smooth worsted weight wool yarn that you can get your perfect stitches. It is a little bit different.
Yeah, don't make it try to be that. You just
Yeah.
love it for what it is.
Exactly. So once I have my 13 stitches, now we're going to bind off. The pattern will tell you exactly how many you need to bind off. I think it's 25, but the pattern will tell you exactly. I'm going to do less here just because I have less on my needle. So when you're binding off, this is one thing that can be a little tricky for people sometimes when they are leaving stitches on the needle and then binding off. You have to remember that we knit 13 and now we're going to start binding off. So we have to knit 1, knit 2 in order to then start binding off. So we're going to just bind off here. And one thing I'm noticing that I'm doing is, so I'm really, and sometimes when I'm knitting, I was really having to push my needle with this index finger just because of how the way I personally knit. And so that's just something to keep in mind. You had mentioned too, Brenda, like you do need to take breaks when you're doing this project. I actually ended up putting a Band-Aid on my index finger because I was using a pretty pointy, because it was just like I was pushing this so much that it was starting to kind of like hurt my finger, honestly. I was repeatedly stabbing myself. So
I've had that problem before when I was making some knitted amigurumis, because I was knitting the fabric so densely that I found myself pushing on that tip, and I'm like, oh, there's like a little dent in my finger now.
Yeah, exactly. And so, yeah, just be aware of that. If you find yourself doing this a lot, you might just put a little Band-Aid. If you have a thimble or something, that would obviously work too. Okay, so I lost count of how many I was binding off, but the pattern will tell you how many to do. And then once you have done that, now we're going to keep knitting. So when you bind off, you'll be left with 1 stitch on your right needle, and that's going to count as the first stitch of your next knit 13. So that would be the first one, and then this would be 2, and so on. And I dropped a Plarn stitch here. But just like regular knitting, we're just gonna pop that back on the needle and keep going. Although I feel like if you dropped a stitch with Plarn,
Maybe it wouldn't unravel as much.
it probably wouldn't. And honestly, I think if I was like way further in my project, I would just take a loop of that Plarn and just like work it in. I don't think I'd try to pick it all the way back up, you know. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 6. All right. And so at this point, we're just left now with a few more stitches to bind off. And so when we're doing the handles actually are the exact same as the bottom of your bag. There's just a different number of stitches. You're going to be slipping one with the yarn in the front and then knitting to the end. And so you're going to do that on one side and basically work your handle like to the halfway point of how long you want your handle to be. And I tell you in the pattern exactly how long mine was. And then for the other handle, you'll just reattach your Plarn and do the same thing. It's just the slip one with the yarn in front, knit to the end. So let's just bind off these last few. Okay. All right, so when we've come to the end here, so we have 13 stitches over here. We've bound off the number indicated in the pattern, but then we have our beginning of the round stitch markers. So we're just going to get rid of that, and then we need to just bind off that last stitch. And then we'll be left with our 13. And so for this one, then we're just knitting across. And now we're just working back and forth on the one half of the handle. Okay. So in the pattern, I said you could use waste yarn or a stitch holder to hold the other half of your stitches, but because you are doing this with a circular needle, my other handle is just gonna rest on the cord while I'm working the first one, which is nice. So yeah, then you would just slip one with the yarn in front, bring the plarn to the back, and keep knitting. So let's just bring our bag in here. So you're gonna work your one side, then reattach your plarn, and then work the other side. And then what you end up with is 2 pieces of handle with stitches. And so we're gonna 3 needle bind off that. And I actually brought non-plarn for that so you could see it. So we're gonna do it with wrong sides together. And so this would be one half of your plarn handle, the other half. And then you do need a 3rd needle for this because it's a 3 needle bind off, right? And so we're going to take our spare needle, we're going to insert into the front stitch, insert the needle into the back, and knit them together. And then we're going to do that one more time. And then pass the first over the second, just like that. So you're essentially knitting the front and the back together and then binding off at the same time. And so that would be your handle. So at this point, you're almost done. So you can weave in all those plarn ends. But then I did add here some little ties just to sort of cinch this in a little bit. I don't know, I thought it looked cute just having like a pleat, like a regular plastic bag.
I love that.
I basically just...
You made a new and improved
I literally
plastic bag out of like 80 plastic bags.
I realize I'm literally just making the plastic bag again.
But it's a million times better.
That's right. So I have one of these large eye yarn needles, and then I'll just show you on this bag. You're going to do it just basically in the 4 corners, but I just basically looped this through like a figure 8, like this, and came back down like this. And there's actually photos in the pattern that'll show you exactly. And then I just tied it and tied it into a knot and then brought it into the inside of the bag. And that's it. That's your plarn bag.
Super cute.
Yeah.
Oh my, well, we have a couple questions and comments, Jen. First, I'll ask this to Jen, but this really could go for both projects here. So Peggy wants to know, the finished bags, they seem to be soft rather than stiff, if that makes sense. Do you want to talk to how they feel in hand? Obviously, we can't feel them through the screen, but if you could talk about how those finished projects feel, that'd be great.
I mean, it's not exactly soft. But it's softer than I thought it was going to be.
It's not at all scratchy.
It's not scratchy.
Jen's is kind of stretchy.
Yeah, mine's pretty.
Mine is very stiff. It's almost like a raffia bag or like a straw bag. It's you know, when you feel it with your hand, it's not scratchy. It's pretty. I mean, it has a little bumpy texture, but the plastic is like little bumps, like corn on the cob, you know?
Yeah.
It's not like scratchy, but the crochet is much stiffer than this has nothing in it, right? Yeah, nothing in it. And you can see, you know, if I put this upright, that's how stiff this fabric is. Yeah, I think the crochet, and this is true of crochet anyway, there's just more structure because of the crochet stitches, where knitted fabric in general tends to be a little more flowy, and we're seeing that in these bags. Yeah.
Well, we have some team crochet and team knitters, and a couple people have mentioned that they're going to be trying the other project as well. So if you notice a little bit of difference between the knitting stitches and the crocheting stitches, that's probably why you'll get a little bit more of that support with one versus the other. Now, we had a comment here from Melissa that maybe both of you can speak to. Melissa's wondering about the beautifully printed Starbucks coffee bean bags. So when you go and get your pound of coffee from Starbucks in those beautiful bags, those are obviously structured a little differently than the plastic bags that you've been using. So maybe speak to whether you would or would not recommend using those, and then maybe think about projects in the future that could reuse those. Melissa would love a craft that would utilize those bags.
I don't know, is that like a regular coffee, like any coffee bean kind of bag, or is there something specific to the Starbucks one?
I'm not sure, because like I'm imagining like a thick coffee bag, and I think that would be really hard to knit or crochet with.
Something like this. Okay, so I have a whole bunch of different types of bags to talk about. This bag is really thick. You can probably hear it more, obviously you can't feel it, but it's a very thick bag, and I did try crocheting with this, and you can, but I would recommend cutting it more narrow, like a 1/2 inch or maybe even 3/8 of an inch if you're gonna crochet with this, because otherwise it's very tiring. I think anything thicker than this would be really challenging, but you should totally prove us wrong.
Yeah, try it.
I mean, I don't want to stop anyone from trying that. There might be other ways to repurpose it, but I would say if you're going to try something that's really thick, the thinner you cut it, the easier it's going to be to work with. You just have to find that balance between, at some point you're going to be cutting it too thin where it might actually break. But yeah, I think the thicker it is, the thinner you should cut your strips.
Yeah, I would agree with that. But yeah, at some point it's going to be too thin.
And I would say do just a little bit of it first and check it out on your, I don't know if you said you were going to knit or crochet, but try it out before you make a whole bunch of it, because it might be really frustrating to work with something that's that thick.
Yeah.
If I'm thinking of the same thing you were, which was just like most coffee bean bags.
Yeah.
Sort of.
They're pretty sturdy and they're pretty reinforced.
Yeah. I would say just cut it really thin. But yeah, not too thin. And I think Brenda you and I talked about this as we were working on these projects at home. It is an experiment. Like I had not done this before. I don't think you had either. And so it was weird, like certain bags from certain stores, I enjoyed knitting with them a little bit more.
Yeah.
And different textures. So this is one of those things where it does take a little bit of experimentation just to figure out what's going to work for you. And one thing I wanted to plug was that since we're both doing this together, both of us have done 14-day Learn to Knit and a 14-day Learn to Crochet series. So if you knit and you're like, but wait, I want to crochet and I don't know how, you can watch Brenda's Learn to Crochet series and vice versa. So you can make both, even if you only know how to do one craft.
That's right.
Yeah.
All right. I'm going to, since we have some time, I would love, is it possible, Brenda, do you have some extra bags? Can you show the Plarn process one more time?
Yep, absolutely. Yep.
Perfect. I know some people would love to see it.
Okay. So like I mentioned at the beginning, in my pattern, there is a little list of different thicknesses of bags and what I would recommend for cutting each one, and like the width I'd recommend cutting your strips into. When you're making Plarn, you're just basically cutting the circular bag into skinny little donuts, like you're just cutting it into slices and then you're linking them together. That's how that works. So these are both newspaper bags. They're very thin and they're very easy on your hands to work with if you have access to those, if you know someone. Oh, that's another thing I wanted to mention was if, like my bag takes 80 to 100 bags. Jen, did you say 60 or 80?
Yeah,
or
mine was like
yours?
60 to 70 bags. Yeah.
It's a lot of bags. And if you don't happen to have all those bags, I would definitely recommend just asking around, like post something in your neighborhood group, or you can just, ask a couple of people you knew. I just asked 2 people and ended up with a whole bunch of awesome bags.
Yeah,
so
same.
People are excited to get rid of them, and they're excited that you're going to be using them in something that's useful and kind of different and cool. All right, so when you're slicing up your bags, I'll show you first on this. You're just, actually Jen, she would lay hers all out flat, and then she used a ruler and a rotary cutter to just make slices in them. Did you do yours at 1 inch or?
Yeah, mine were all like 1 inch.
About 1 inch.
All my bags were kind of like the
Uniform.
same grocery store type bags.
Yeah. So for these, the way that I did mine, I just kind of rolled them up like this, and then you just snip the end off that has the seam in it, because you can't use that, so you have to recycle that. And then you're going to cut this. If it's a bag like this type of bag, maybe you can hear what that type of bag might feel like. I would say 1 inch or so wide would be good. For these are just a little thinner. I would cut them at maybe 1.5 inches. Or even for thinner bags, like a produce bag if you go to the grocery store and you're putting your corn in those really thin, actually I have one of those, these really thin bags, I would cut that at like 2 inches. 1.5 inches to 2 inches for something that's thinner like that. And the reason that I'm telling you all these different widths is because when you link it all up, you want your yarn to be, your plarn, to be fairly uniform as you're crocheting or knitting with it. If you're thinking, oh, Brenda, that's so high maintenance, I am not going to do that. I'm just going to cut all my yarn into 1 inch strips and stack it all up. It'll turn out fine. You'll just have some areas. It'll be like knitting or crocheting with thick and thin yarn. So if you mix all of your pieces up really well, then it won't matter so much, because the thicker pieces might nest in with the thinner pieces and it'll all kind of even out. But if you're going to do stripes, like how Jen and I did bigger blocks of stripes in our pieces, and you're going to, if one of them is a really thin yarn or thin bag that you made your yarn out of and one's really thick, then you're going to have, it's going to maybe go in and out a little bit.
Yeah.
Because it's going to change your gauge. All right, so here you take 2 loops to start, place 1 loop over another. So this blue one is on top of the pink one. You reach through the one that's on top, reach through the blue one, and up through the underside to grab the blue again. Then you just hold on to the opposite side and pull that through, and you link it together. So you're just going to continue doing that. I'll do a couple more. Place the new one on top of the old, reach underneath, through the new one and underneath, up under the old one, grab onto it, and pull it through. And so because I cut up these really small circumference bags, they're really easy to put together. You end up with a lot of knots, but they're pretty small, so it's not a big deal. But what happens if you cut a larger circumference bag? Like this one's a little bit bigger. I just want to show you. This one also has pleats. Jen and I talked about this earlier.
Yes.
We didn't really notice that bags had pleats before we did this. So I'm going to just sort of put your thumb or your finger inside the bottom of that pleat and pull on it to actually fold it into that pleated shape. And you could do like Jen did, stack a bunch up, rotary cut them, or you can roll them up. The reason that I'm rolling them is just because it's easier to get a straight cut. If you don't have a ruler and a rotary cutter, you just roll them up. So these I'm going to cut in 1 inch wide strips. You can just eyeball it. They don't need to be perfect. It's really fine. You don't need to be too worried about it. So you just slice it all up. And again, you can't use the handle part, so you just have to recycle that part. Can't use the bottom where it was seamed together. I already got rid of that. And then you just open these up like that. And then, let me see, I'll put this below so you can see a little better on the white background. So you're going to take your white bag, the new bag, lay it on top of the old bag, and reach in here, up from the bottom, and pull on it. And now the next one I want to show you, this was one of those things that I learned after working on my plarn for a while. When you have bigger strips like this and you're linking them together, sometimes when you link it into a knot, your knot might end up like right here. And then you end up with this annoying loop on the bottom and it's tight here, and then you have to sort of like undo the knot. So in order to make sure you're getting this even on both sides, I would link it together like this, and then I would slide my hand up and just grab onto it where that fold is, place the new one on top, reach from underneath and grab, and then you have a lot less wiggle room as to where your knot's gonna go. You just pull it through.
Yeah, I did the same thing too, because I found like I was getting this part where it was like, yeah, the knot wasn't directly across, and
then
well,
you end up with a little excess in one of the...
Yeah, but I was lazy and I just would kind of fold it into the yarn and then knit it in.
And that's totally fine. I did that too. I mean, if we're being honest, I would just shove it in there.
Yeah.
And that's fine, but you know, it is a little annoying when you get to that and you have that loop sticking out. You're like, oh, what do I do with that? So, you know, if you just hold on to it a little further up so there's not as much, you know, you can't get the knot in the wrong spot really, then it helps when you're putting it all together. And then you just wind it all up.
Well, my final thoughts really are just go for it. Just remember, we're repurposing something. This does not have to be perfect. We're not talking like an heirloom baby blanket that's going to be passed down for generations. So just take your time. If you know, a stitch or two is off, it's not a big deal. I wouldn't say that this is a great beginner project just because the material is a little bit hard to work with. But if you are a beginner knitter or a beginner crocheter, these are definitely accessible patterns. It's more the material, I think, that maybe bumps it up to more an intermediate project. But just go for it. And if you do make it, tag us on social media. And also on our websites, we have project galleries where you can upload your photos too. And I love taking a look at those and seeing what everybody's making. So be sure to share your projects with us.
Yeah. Yeah, I was just going to add on and say that, you know, because it's kind of a harder material to work with, just make sure that you take lots of breaks and stretch out, and maybe have a second project that you're working on, even if you're like project monogamous, you know, just get another project so you can switch back and forth between them, because it is, you know, it can be harder on your hands. So, you know, keep that in mind. But yeah, like Jen was saying, I mean, this is a very good time to be experimental and to try something new. I mean, we both did it and it was super fun. So yeah, go for it. I say go for it, and just be excited about that you're keeping all these bags out of the landfill and making something super useful with it.
Well, my name's Colleen Tauke, and I work with National Quilter Circle. So quilting is kind of my thing, but I also came into quilting from a sewing background. A grandmother, a mother, a grandmother, a great grandmother, a mother, and then me. And then my daughter sews too. So it's kind of been in our blood all the way along. And as I was thinking about the upcycling type project that we're going to work on today, it actually brought to mind my grandfather, who never let anything go to waste. He was one of those collectors of pieces and parts, and he saw things in a different light. So he always was thinking, how can I reuse, repurpose, what we call today upcycling of pieces than things that he had. Maybe they were more gears and metal and farm implements, but in the quilt world, we always look at things with that eye of, how can I reuse or repurpose something? So we are going to be working on a what I call a curb cover. It's a term that I kind of coined, because when we were going to picnics or even to ball games, I used to get this weird look when people saw me put a quilt on the ground. They would say, if I had a quilt like that, I would never put it on the ground or on the grass. And so over time, I was thinking I should create something that is used to sitting on the ground or on the grass. Well, that happened to be the backside of my blue jeans or any other blue jeans you can find. They have been worn, used, well loved over the years, but there's usually something still usable in those blue jeans. And so that's where the idea of the curb cover, or it could be used as a picnic quilt, also came to life. And I had it kind of floating around in the back of my mind for a long time, but decided finally a couple of years ago, I have grandkids. It's time for a really durable picnic blanket that won't blow away in the wind. And it will take a beating because I think my grandkids could give it a beating. So that's where I come in making the curb cover or the picnic quilts. So we are going to be, you can download that pattern. The pattern has a little girl sitting on the curb cover. That's my oldest granddaughter, Daisy. And she agreed to be my model that day when I was wanting to take a picture. So hopefully we can get people dissecting some blue jeans and making a fun project. Let's just at least look at what the curb cover or picnic quilt looks like. I can unroll part of it. My studio space isn't very big here, but what we're creating is something that looks like this. It has rows of denim and then some fun fabrics. I had collected, well, we quilters, we tend to collect our fabrics. I collected red, white, and blues over the years. So that was the logical place for me to go, was to that collection. Here's a way to use them. But you may have other fabrics in your stash that you would like to use, something bright and cheery, maybe something that's more in the plaids or more masculine looking. That might be really great to use. But the reds and blues alternating in rows. So this is kind of long because when you go to a parade and you sit at the curb, you tend to take up the length of the curb, especially with my grandkids all coming to watch a parade. So that's what we're going to be working on. So dig into your fabrics. Things that you can cut at least an 8-inch square from can be used in this project. So I had that collection of red, white, and blues that I had put away. So I went ahead and started cutting the red, white, and blues into those 8-inch squares. Then my husband and my kids have always given me the blue jeans once they get a little worn. Oh, there's a rip in this one. Can you fix it? Well, as we know, most of us put those in the pile to fix later, and we'll get around to it eventually. In the meantime, they go and buy a new pair. And that gives us the denim that we can use for this project. Now, when I was going through to find a pair, these look pretty good, except this is why they were on the pile. One too many stress points at the pocket and away they went. So trying to fix that was not going to happen. So they went into the cut up pile. So collect up the number of blue jeans approximately. I have listed in there that takes about 6 or 7 pairs of men's blue jeans to do this project. But depending on the width of the leg and the height of the person who wore them, it may take a couple pair more than that. My husband happens to be 6'2", so we've got some long inseams and lots of denim to use up. So the denim is the other thing that we need to collect. Then simple quilting supplies, your cutting mat, your rotary cutter, a square ruler, around a 10.5 or 12.5 inch square is what I'm going to be demoing with today, was what I used when I was cutting out my pieces. A fabric marking tool, if you prefer to mark the crisscross that we are going to put. I have a couple done here. We're going to put a crisscross, and I don't know if I can hold this up to the camera. There we go. The crisscross stitching line across each of the blocks later. I'm going to show you a trick that you won't have to mark the blocks, and you may want to try that part out, because marking all of these does take time. So wait on the marking tool until you see the trick, and maybe you'll want to try it out that way. The other thing is a spring-loaded scissors for later when you go to actually do the clipping on the seams, because we're going to do rag style. So the spring-loaded scissors does help reduce the stress on your hands. So a spring-loaded pair of scissors. This is a longer blade. They do make an actual rag quilt scissors that has a very short blade. If you already have one of those, great. If you don't, these will work. If not, a nice sharp pair of scissors. Make sure that's a must. It has to be nice and sharp. A walking foot is an option, but I did find that because this is, yes, it is quilting, but because it's a rag style and it's going to be a picnic blanket or a curb cover, the exactness isn't so much of a strict rule about having to use the walking foot so there's no shifting. A little shift will be okay. So if you don't have a walking foot, that's fine. You can use the regular foot on your domestic machine. Let's see. The rag brush that looks like this is a very stiff bristled brush, and it does help to rag the seams later. I did find this very useful to help kind of rough up the seams and get that fluffy look at the seam allowances that we're going to clip later. Washing it also can do that, but because this is very heavy, you're going to have to be taking it to a commercial laundromat. So this could be kind of the savior, so you don't have to wash it right away. So the brush for doing rag quilts, some pins, but you know what? We usually as quilters have those really fine pins in our pin cushion, but if at some point you purchase those sturdier pins that have a little bit heavier metal to them, go get them out of the drawer. You can use them on this project if you like to use pins. A thread that you want to stitch through the denim and the prints. Now on mine, I use kind of a khaki color because most blue jeans kind of have a khaki color or a golden color thread through them, but you could use a red. You can coordinate with whatever fabric you're using for your thread. Then you're going to need, of course, your iron and a pressing surface. If you're going to make this into the picnic quilt, I will show you real quick. On the back side, we're going to do kind of a loop system to join two curb covers together so you can have a picnic quilt. And I use these very large buttons, and the size is listed in the instructions. And then I used simple ponytail loops that come in a package like this. You can find it in any big box store. And I lashed them together in the center. The end, we'll talk about that. But simple little ponytail loop. Let's see if I hold it up against something white so you can actually see. I made it into a figure 8. So then I could jump from one curb cover to the other and hold my two pieces together temporarily to make it into the quilt, the picnic quilt. So we've got one of the loops over the button, and we'll talk about that at the end. But if you want to do that, then the buttons and the ponytail loops are important at that step. Let's see, what else do we have? That's pretty much all of our supplies. So are there any questions about any of the supplies and things that I've talked about so far?
We've got one comment. Thank you for talking about the stiff brush. Dawn has had one of those stiff brushes. Didn't know what it was for, so now we know.
Most definitely. Even after ragging 2 of these, and they're quite big after a while, there's a lot of seams to rough up. I mean, this looks like it's brand new right out of the package from the quilt shop, and you can find them online. So they will last and last, and they actually do a really good job. Just don't rake it across your fingers. It's kind of rough. It's definitely made for the denim especially. Mm-hmm. Okay, so we're going to get into some cutting then if we don't have any other questions.
Ready to go.
Okay. So the first thing we need to do, I have listed, is basically go through your fabrics. And for the curb cover, you will need 72 squares of fabrics. So I have cut just some of the reds and blues that like I used in my original. So we have those 8-inch squares. This is a good place if you are new to quilting to practice your cutting. So if it's off by a little bit here or there, it's not going to matter because you're going to clip that and rag those seam allowances. So a good place to practice is here on something like this, where accuracy is important, but not critical to the outcome of your project. So 8-inch squares. on the denim or on the prints, whatever fabrics you use. As I was thinking about it today, for some reason, I think it was when I was working on this, my kid had just gone into the military so I kind of had red, white, and blue on the brain. And I was thinking later, it's like, oh, plaids would be so fun. Some homespuns, maybe leftover fabrics from all the quilts you've made. You can probably cut an 8-inch square out of a lot of the leftover fabrics that we tend to not have the heart to throw away because we've purchased them, we've used them in a quilt, and now we're thinking, oh, I just can't throw those away. So 8-inch squares, 72 of them to make just the curb cover itself. If you want to make it into the picnic quilt, you're going to need double that. So 144 squares. So like I said, if you're new to quilting and you need to practice using your rotary cutter and your ruler, and this is the place to practice. Okay, now the fun part is cutting apart the blue jeans. So find your favorite podcast or your favorite Netflix show so you can sit and kind of what I call deboning a blue jean. It's going to be that we're cutting it apart. And what I do is start at one of the legs and work my way up along the flat felled seam. Now, if you don't know what a flat felled seam is, it's that really heavy double stitched seam on your jeans. And it's usually on the inside of the leg. It's really durable. It's very thick. And some of our sewing machines don't like to stitch over that. So that way I'm kind of avoiding using that in my projects. So I follow up onto one side of that so that I can open up the leg and get a large piece of fabric that I can cut my 8-inch squares from. Now, when you get to the back side or the crotch line, just follow that up. You've got a flat felled seam there too. That's that heavy seam. Now, on this pair, I can't really salvage much of these pockets because he's worn through the denim here, unless I wanted to go back and patch that. Trying to find pieces where you can cut out a pocket on an 8-inch square can be a little tricky. I did find some blue jeans. I think they must have belonged to some of my boys that were a little bit smaller blue jeans, so the pockets were a little smaller. And then I could cut an 8-inch square with the pocket intact because I wanted to use it on the top of the curb cover, a place to stash that bag. You know, every parade has candy. And so I was wanting to find a place where I could stash away bags for my grandkids to use when they were at the parade. So then you're coming around the side seam. We're going to cut through. When you get to the pocket area from the front, it's a little tricky to kind of get one layer there and cut away that pocket underneath because we don't need the patch pockets or the pockets from the front. That was the part that my dad always wore out on his blue jeans. And then go around the zipper and back to the crotch line. So we're basically going to take away, we're going to work on one leg at a time. That one for later. I have now opened up and look at all that great denim I have. A big, huge area of denim that I can cut 8-inch squares from. Now, if someone in your household is wearing those skinny jeans, you're going to have a little bit of an issue on cutting 8-inch squares because what you want is without the seam if possible. On my machine tends to kind of balk going over these thick seams. If you have a higher grade, more powerful motor in your sewing machine and you know it can deal with those seams, and you can include those. But my machine kind of struggles when it gets to that seam, and sometimes I will push too hard and snap a needle. So we don't want to have frustration. We want to have fun in our project, and I'm going to try and eliminate those seams. So I've gone on the leg. I've made sure that I can cut an 8-inch square. So I've cut two sides of my piece here. Then I will rotate this And then I can cut the other two sides to make an 8-inch square. Now, someone might ask, what about the grain line? And is it going to be straight of grain? This is a curb cover, a picnic blanket. Grain line isn't quite as important. I remember those days of getting a pair of blue jeans that weren't made on the grain line, and the leg wanted to twist, the pant leg wanted to twist around my leg and felt really uncomfortable, but no one's wearing this. So grain line isn't quite as critical in this kind of an example. So we have 8-inch squares of the denim, and then we just, look, this is my waist now. Much better to throw this little piece in the wastebasket than the entire pair of blue jeans. And then I can just progress up the leg, cutting out my 8-inch squares and getting as many as I can, usually around 4, sometimes 5 if you're really lucky. If you have someone who's really tall in your household, you may get more than I do even then off of this. But you will just progress along, cutting those 8-inch squares. Now, there were times in my cutting that I found there was a stain or there was tree marking paint. My husband's a forester, so orange tree marking paint on there, or paint from doing something around our house. I just left it in there because I figured it just shows that they were worn and loved. The denim is still good, the paint or the marking, or even if it's a stain from dirt or grease, it's not going to really change the way this project wears or is used. It just adds a little character to the project. So I went ahead and left those pieces in. Now, some of the denims today might have those big rips across them. Those probably aren't going to work very well for this project, because then the batting would actually show through to the front or to the back of the quilt. So we do need to have denim that is fairly intact, not gaping holes in the fabric. So, okay, we've got to just, let me finish cutting up this one. And then we can, again, just little scraps. And you just keep going until you use up the entire pant leg and then move on to the next pair. So it will be a very small pile of waste when you're done. But see, I have enough blue jeans to do probably 2 or 3 more of these. You know, denim doesn't last forever. So, okay, now, once we have our pile of squares and our denim, oh, in our instructions for the yardage, I did list there the blocks that you need of batting. So let me separate my squares here. I have a stack of batting. Now, as quilters, we tend to trim away when we get done having a quilt quilted or do it ourselves, or if it's coming back from the long armor, there tends to be a margin all the way around our quilt where there's strips of batting. And I have too much of my grandfather in me. I couldn't throw away those strips, and I kept them around, and voila, you can cut 7-inch squares out of those strips very, very easily. In fact, I got to the point where I just needed a little bit more, and I had some scraps. I even chain pieced or zigzagged some of them together so that I could get that one more piece out of the square that I had. So some of us would call that Franken batting, where we put pieces together and zigzag across so that we can use up all those pieces. So 7-inch squares of batting is what we will need for the interior portion as we assemble all of this. So do we have any questions out there, Leah?
Again, no questions about the project just yet. Couple comments from people just saying hi and tuning in. So we've got a lot of people that are excited for this project. So we're ready to move on to the next step.
Great. I love it that people are joining us to see what kind of things we can do with that stack of blue jeans that's in the laundry room we just want to get rid of.
Exactly.
We're going to cut it down and make something. Okay. The first thing I have you do is to make the denim sandwiches. So we're going to work with just the denim pieces first. So let's put the ruler out of the way. Now we're done with that cutting. And when I talk about a sandwich, and as quilters, we know that a quilt sandwich means that we have a backing, we have a batting, and we have a quilt top. But in this case, both of them are denim, because if you look on the diagram that's on page 4, you'll notice that there are rows that are just real light blue. Those are rows where both of the front and the back are denim. Because on our curb cover, the whole portion that touches the ground is made out of denim. So it's nice and sturdy. Okay, so we are going to place the first square right side down. If it happened to be flipped over, the light side of the denim works also. So you can vary the color that goes into your quilt, because some blue jeans are lighter and others are dark. So you can vary that if you'd like. But in this case, most of the time I put the right side down. Then I centered my batting square. It is 1 inch smaller than your fabric squares. So you'll have about a 1/2 inch margin around all the 4 sides. You don't need to measure it. Close counts in this realm. Don't ask me that when I'm trying to put some really complicated quilt block together, but today we're having fun. So center that batting and then put the second piece of denim on top. Now you can, if you look at denim, you also will notice that there's kind of a striation, kind of a stripe to the way it's woven and printed. And that can vary back and forth in your placement later. So it won't make a difference which direction you put it here. If you're at all worried about layers shifting, you can use a simple spray based. You could use a glue stick, whatever makes you more comfortable sewing across this. Some people will put in a couple of pins, but because it's a rag quilt, and I said we were going to have fun today, I'm going to do it without pins and without basting. The batting really does help the layers from shifting, and it's a very sturdy fabric, so you can get a grip on it and take it under the machine. Now, remember I said that if you didn't want to mark all of the lines, we're going to make diagonal stitching lines across the block in both directions, that you could do it without marking. So here's the trick. I've got my sewing machine. I'm going to take the stitch length up to 3.5. It doesn't need to be tiny little stitches. 3.5 is enough to keep the stitch or the layers intact, one above the other. Now, I read this somewhere and I was really skeptical of using this technique, and then I did it and it worked, and I was like, yes, I don't have to mark them all. So if you put your needle in one corner, put your presser foot down, and our tendency is to want to look right where the needle is stitching. But suspend that thought for a moment, put your needle down, and stare at the corner you want to stitch to. Stare only at that, let the machine do the work, and you will somehow make a straight line to the other side. So here we go. The first time I did this, it was so hard not to look at the needle, because as quilters and as seamstresses and sewers, we look at the needle. We want to know where that needle falls every time, but the machine knows how to do the work. So let it do its work. Now that I've got my needle in the down position and I've taken a couple stitches so I know that it's lodged well, I'm going to stare at the opposite end of my block, at the other corner, and let the machine do the work. If I stare where I want to stitch to, you will finish at your finger every time. Now, it might not be absolutely perfect, but it's not bad. It's acceptable for a rag quilt, most definitely. So we're going to do that again and go the opposite direction, making sure that the needle's well lodged in the fabric. Take that first 2 or 3 stitches. You don't need to reinforce. We're going to sew over these seams later when we join everything together, so we don't have to reinforce stitch at the beginning. Line it up. Put your finger on the tip where you want to drive to. Stare at it. Resist the temptation to look up and drive to your finger. Now, there's an X. Looks fine to me. It's acceptable. I can go on to the next set. So, how many people are willing to try it? Join in. Let me know if you're willing to at least try it on one block without marking today. Is there any takers out there?
I'm going to keep an eye and see how many people you've convinced, Colleen.
I know.
We've got one question about the thread you're using. Lisa wants to know if you're using cotton thread, or is there anything else specific you want to know?
Just to double check so I don't lie. It is cotton thread. It is a 50 weight cotton thread. It's a little bit, it's bright red because of the red, white, and blue project. So it's a nice sturdy cotton thread, but you could use any thread you have available. It's not going to matter if it's a polyester. I wouldn't use a monofilament, and I probably wouldn't use a rayon thread. You know, some of the decorative threads, they're a little finer, and I know that they have a great sheen to them. But in this project, we need sturdy because we are going through denim. So the other thing is that you probably want to make sure that you have at least a size 14 needle in your sewing machine. Many of us will use a size 80-12 when we are doing piecing for most of our quilting. And a 14 is just a step up from that size so that we have a little bit sturdier needle in our machine for doing work that's going to be on denim like this. So make sure that you think about that. Change out your needle. It does need to be a really sharp. If you haven't changed your needle in a long time, this might be the time to change it out, because you're gonna drive it pretty hard because this is denim and you're going through 2 layers of denim and the batting. So you're going to want to have a nice sharp needle in your machine.
A couple people have already jumped on board. They're willing to try it. And speaking of driving, Janice actually put in that this is like driving. So you look beyond the steering wheel to where you want the car to go. You're looking beyond the needle to where you want your stitches to go. So I like that.
Yep. My dad was a truck driver, and I remember being chastised of quit looking down right in front of the car because you're driving like this. Look out to the horizon and you'll drive a straight line. So yes, it works. It's just no one ever applied it to the sewing machine before. And it is so smart because trying to use either a chalk liner, a Hera marker, or even a friction pen on all of these squares would just take so long. And since the exactness doesn't need to be that extreme, I think this just makes this project that much more fun and enjoyable, because the marking is kind of a boring step that most of us would like to get away from. Okay, I am kind of a neat freak when it comes to trimming tails and threads, just because we are going to make a ragged mess later, and I don't want those extra threads just kind of floating around. So I do trim off any of those kind of thread tails as I get to the ends of my blocks so that it's a little bit neater and tidier. Okay, so we did the denim sandwiches. Then I went on, as we were talking, to make, I had a kind of a dominant blue and denim sandwich. These are variations of the peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. One is blue raspberry and one is strawberry. So we have fabric with that batting inside with denim on the back side again, so that in your instructions, it will tell you how many of, if you're going to do a 2-color like this, how many of the dominant blue color you would need and how many dominant red color. You can substitute your colors in there or do completely scrappy. That is your choice. Now, let's see. We are going to arrange the sandwiches that we created into short rows. And some people may say, well, why not just create one big long row and then join the rows together? Because dragging that big long row through the sewing machine is heavy and not a lot of fun. So I did them in short bunches so that maybe I would end up having like 3 sections then, so they were smaller, more manageable than to join to put through the machine at the end. So when you go to look at the diagram on page 4, you will see there are the light blue rows. Those are the rows where you're using denim that's on both sides of your sandwich. And then you're going to be using those red and blues alternating in short rows and 2 short rows kind of paired together. Now, this was just an arrangement that I came up with because I didn't want 2 red blocks beside each other and 2 blue blocks right next to each other. So if you're doing scrappy, you can have fun and arrange them however you'd like. But the idea then is to make rows that have 4 blocks in them. So when it comes to the denim pieces, 1, 2, 3, let me get one more here, 4. Now you can play around with the colors of denim. This one's a little darker. It kind of gives a little contrast there. Do I have another one? This pair of jeans was worn about the same. This is a little darker. I'm going to make the kind of the striations in the denim go different directions just to add some texture to it. And we're going to join this into a row of 4. And since it's denim on both sides, this is how we need to pick things up. We're going to join the first 2 together. And if you've never done a rag quilt before, if you're new to quilting and you didn't get in on the first go around of rag quilting, we're going to do exposed seams. So I'm going to join these 2 edges together here, end to end. If you want to pin, you can, but these are very thick, so it may bend your pins. Those sturdier pins are nice to use. Here we're going to set, I don't know if I noted the stitch length for joining rows. I don't know if I said to shorten it up or not. Let me double check. I did not. You know, because this denim is so thick, a 3.5 will still work fine. But remember, we're moving to a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So if you're used to doing that little bitty quarter, you need to double that size. And if you need to, just for reference sake, use a small ruler, because as quilters, we're kind of really used to where the 1/4 inch seam is on our presser foot and are not so familiar maybe with where 1/2 inch is. So I'm using just a simple seam gauge. You can use a ruler, put it against the needle, and then figure out what marking on your sewing machine bed is going to be a 1/2 inch. So you have a guide to follow. If it doesn't want to line up exactly with any of the kind of gridded lines that are on the base of your sewing machine, you can get a piece of painter's tape, a Post-it note, something to give yourself a guide for where the 1/2 inch seam width will be at. Now, when we're going to join these, we're going to do kind of a reinforced stitch at the beginning. I'm going to do just a little 2 or 3 stitches right on top of each other. If your sewing machine doesn't do a reinforced stitch like that, you may want to start about a 1/4 inch into the fabric, go in reverse, and then forward to do a back stitch there to reinforce that seam allowance. Then stitch your 1/2 inch seam. Now, even I have to think about I didn't start in the right spot. I am so used to going to a 1/4 that I didn't get it right either. So really be aware of where that 1/2 inch seam allowance needs to be, because all of our math is all set up. You want to have a consistent seam allowance throughout so everything fits together. And you can hear my sewing machine is kind of like, that's a lot of thickness. Just don't go too fast. Work your way across and then reinforce stitch on the far side. And cut thread. Okay, now I need to snip those those stitches at the very beginning there, so that where I was too shallow, the stitching is going to fall right up next to the batting inside. So the batting will be kind of snuck and tucked inside the center of each of your blocks. Okay, so when we open this up, our seam allowance there. Now, it's not perfect. One slid a little bit to one side there. That's fine. That's totally acceptable in this project. Then we're going to pick up our next one and join that. Get them laid out beside each other. And once you start picking up a few of these, you'll realize, oh, there's a reason why I'm not doing long rows, because this is a lot of weight. That's why at the very end of the instructions, it will tell you that if and when you're going to launder this, take it to an industrial laundromat, because think of the weight of this project and then get it wet. You're going to add a lot of weight, and that's a lot of stress on your domestic washing machine and dryer. So take it to an industrial machine that is used to doing large loads that are very, very heavy. Making sure as you progress, adding the next one, that you are using, or you have your seams going in the same direction. It's very easy to accidentally pick one up and seam it to the opposite side, and then the seams will go back and forth. And the idea is to have kind of a clean backside like this, with the clipped, ragged portion all being to the other side of the quilt project. So go ahead and join 4 of those together. We'll just do 3 for now, and we're going to then go on to making the red and blue version. Same thing. Here, it's the denim sides that go together. It's not as difficult to remember which direction to pair them on this one, because the denim sides always go together. Always do that reinforced stitch at the very beginning, and then work your way across the blocks. And then reinforce at the other end. And then we are going to, I'm going to take this over to the ironing board. We're going to do just a little bit of ironing here, a little pressing. Our spare pieces out of the way. Don't need our rotary cutter right now. Now, the seam allowances here are pressed open for a reason, because as we join things together, we are going to join here, and in order to reduce that bulk where these seams are going to be across from each other, by opening the seams up, we can reduce the bulk somewhat. It's still going to be thick. Your machine will need to go very slowly over those seam intersections. But by pressing them open, we can do that a little bit more with less difficulty, I guess, is the question. It is the description here. Now, my iron cooled down while I was talking, so I'm going to make sure that it's good and hot before we move on to that next step.
Do you have time for a few questions?
Sure. Go for it.
All right. Well, we've got one from Thelma to go back over. She says, sorry to ask this late, but can you use jeans needles and jeans thread, or a thicker thread like 40 weight?
You can. A 16 needle or an 18 needle, the numbers get bigger, the needle gets bigger. It makes a bigger hole as it goes down through the fabric so that you can use a heavier thread, because it's kind of a groove down the front of our needle, and then that thread can ride nicely down through there. And you can use a heavier thread if you prefer. That's a possibility. I think I didn't have an 18 available at the time, so I tried it with the 14 and it worked. So, you know, I don't know if you need to go quite to an 18. That's a really big hole through there. A 16 needle would probably do fine for joining the pieces. So.
Awesome. Gail also has a question about what you're using, but this is about the batting. So she wants to know, what type or weight of batting are you using for this project?
Mine happened to be all scraps of of Quilter's Dream 70/30. That's what I use as a long armor, and that's what I end up having the most scraps of, because people sometimes will buy batting from me and then they don't want the extra piecer on the outside edges, so I end up with those strips a lot. And the 70/30 is a nice weight. It's quite sturdy. It's easy to cut. It does have a scrim on it, so when I have it on the cutting mat, it doesn't stretch out when I'm maneuvering it around. Another thing to remember is that sometimes when we're cutting batting, this happens to me. My mat is upstairs that I was cutting these on. But as we're cutting batting pieces, sometimes it leaves kind of our fuzzy residue in our mat, and it's very hard to get out. Here is my tip. It will build muscle in your arm, but it does work. I wish I had that mat down here because it's kind of messy upstairs. But that batting kind of gets embedded in our cutting mat, and by using a circular motion with a scrap of batting, it will pull that batting out of the mat, going in one circular motion and then reverse, and it pulls it out of the mat and keeps your mat nice and clean. I've had mats that looked kind of like a furry bear when I got done, but then going back and doing that circular motion with a piece of just a scrap batting, pulled it all out, and the mat is like new again. So if your mat gets messy when you're cutting the batting, that's one way that you can clean up your cutting surface to look like new again.
All right, I'm going to hold the rest of the questions for later so we can get to all the steps of this project.
Okay. Now, I've got my iron set to the highest setting at cotton. Excuse me. I'm going to press my seam allowances open. And it's very strange that you would think that denim, which has so much stiffness and thickness to it, that it wouldn't press nicely, but it does. It just lays wide open and gives you a nice flat finish. So laying there, and then do the same on the pieces that have the cotton print on one side, so that you have nice flat product. Now I'm going to do this with kind of a short row to join here, but I wanted to demo as we're joining these pieces together. We're going to join them like this. And if it really matters to you, when you see on the back that the seam lines line up perfectly, you can put either a pin on each side, because trying to pin through that thickness is going to be almost next to impossible. It's very, very thick there. Or you could use wonder clips. If you're a person who likes wonder clips, those will help at least keep them next to each other as you manipulate this over to your sewing machine, because it can shift just a little bit. But I've pinned on both sides of my seam there. Close will count when we do this. And again, then we're just going to join with that 1/2 inch seam allowance to join the rows together, those short rows that we were working on. Always remember to do that little reinforced stitch at the beginning so that there's that sturdiness at the beginning of each of the seams. The reason why I say that is that I didn't do that on a couple of rows, and later there seemed to be a popping at the end of the seam. So I had to come up with a way to remember to do that reinforced stitch, because as quilters, we don't do that. It's kind of a garment sewing thing that I had to erase from my toolbox, because I came to quilting with a sewing background. Now it did balk. My machine just bounced a little bit when it got to that intersection. Go slow as you go through the thickness of the seam. The needle needs to have time to go down between the weave of the fabric, but it makes it through. This is not a speed piecing time with all that thickness. Okay, just a little bit further here, and then we'll talk about that outside edge finish as we join all of our pieces together. Okay, so now we have the join between those short rows, and we're going to go and we're going to open up that seam again at the ironing surface. And if they're not perfectly aligned, I've got a little bit of a stair step there, no problem. I can trim that in the process where I'm going to do my clipping soon. So that's going to be the outside edge of my curb cover. Now, if a seam slides to one side or the other and both of them aren't perfectly aligned over each other, this is a situation where that's totally fine, because we're going to make a mess of all of our seam allowances here in just a minute, which became kind of a, let's go sit outside and on the patio and do the clipping for this, because it does get a little bit messy. My suggestion is do not wear black leggings while you're clipping, because I have a picture of myself covered in little pieces of fabric as I was working on this. So now we have that seam allowance pressed open. See how that just, the heat of the iron and the weight of the iron just gives it a nice press. Now, if we had all of our rows together and we had 4 across and is it 15 the other direction? I can't remember now. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 14. I'm sorry. 4 by 14. This would be the entire length of my surface here. Once we get to this point, before we start doing any clipping, we need to finish this outside edge, because the seams can still be pulled here. And if we want to clip that outer edge, we want to have a place to clip to, kind of a margin to give ourselves. So this is the tip. We're going to take this to the sewing machine, and we're going to run a stitching line 1/2 inch in all the way around the perimeter of our 4 by 14 curb cover. Now, when you get to those seams where there's seam allowances, do a back stitch or stitch back, reinforce that area, because that will lock those seams so that that stress point won't give if someone happens to tug on it or shake it, or when it's laundered. So do a reinforce as you get to those seam allowances. So setting it for that 1/2 inch again, know where your 1/2 inch still is, and run that stitching line all the way around the perimeter. We get to that intersection of seams, we're going to do a little reinforced stitch there so that it's nice and thick, right, stitched right there. Every time I get to one spot, my machine just says, really? You want me to go over that? Okay, here we go. Just go slow and do that. Remember to do that reinforced stitch at every intersection. Just go very slowly. Even you can hand turn the hand wheel. That's the other thing, that if your machine has a problem getting through those thick spots, the hand wheel, that circle on the end of your sewing machine, you can turn that by hand to slowly stitch through those areas without breaking a needle. Remember to do your reinforced stitch as you get over it, and then move on. So we kind of have a manual way to run that needle. Remember, the hand wheel on the end of your sewing machine, that round piece, you can turn that by hand, which will raise the needle, take a stitch, and bring the needle back down, so that if you know when you get to those thick spots, your machine has an issue getting through there, you can do it by hand through the very thickest portion of the seam allowances there. I'm not wanting people to let me know later, I broke 3 needles because when I got to the thick spot, my machine did not like it. Okay, I'm at the corner. I'm leaving my needle in the down position. I'm going to just move my entire project and rotate so I can progress in the opposite direction of around the corner to keep going. So we have, just do one more seam here. And as I get to that thickest part that my machine really doesn't like, I'm going to turn the hand wheel, because that way I can time it out as it goes through that thick area so that the machine isn't just jumping. It knows, oh, okay, I'm gonna walk through this area very carefully, not break a needle, and progress. Okay, so we've got the entire curb cover put together. We have all of our seam allowances pressed open. We've done that outside perimeter stitching at 1/2 inch. We've reinforced where our seam allowances, where we stitched over those. If at some point you forget that part, you can always go back after you've stitched it and stitch again. That will just reinforce it one more time. Okay, any other questions out there?
You know, we do have a few, but we have a little less than 5 minutes left. So I'm going to
Oh,
hold
no.
them so you can
Okay.
finish up on
We
the whole
are-
project.
We are going to do our clipping, and it's just the time that takes to sit and snip all of our seam allowances. You don't want to snip through the stitching or the seam line. Snip up to about 1/8 of an inch from the stitching line, and do your clipping about every 3/8 of an inch or so. When you're done, you can take that really tough little brush and you can create those ragged edges. And yes, you're going to have crumbs, so make sure that you're not wearing black when you work on this. And then you're going to want to go through all of the seam allowances that you pressed open and do the same exact thing. So in the end, where those seam allowances may have slid to one side or the other, no one's ever going to see them because you're going to rough them up, make them look raggy and fun. Let's see. Let's look at our project here real quick. Time always goes way too fast.
It sure does.
Get into a project and you're just having so much fun. Okay, so there. This has not been washed. This is just, I've just used the brush. I took it out, sat it on the driveway, and just sat and brushed until all those little pieces created that one wonderful texture there. So you can see how all the seams are done. I incorporated, see, I did find a couple of denim pockets that were a little bit smaller that I could incorporate to hide away the little goodie bag that I made. The instructions are a bonus at the end of your pattern. It's just simply a circle of fabric. And I tell you how large to cut that. And then I used the rolled hem foot on my machine, or you could do a serged edge. You could do just a turned edge, however you want to finish the outer edge of the circle. I added these little like belt loops because we're using denim, so I was kind of on the denim feel. I add these little belt loops. It tells you how to create those in the pattern also. And those are then spaced all the way around the outside of my circle. I created a long strip of fabric that I cut kind of like a bias strip so that I could have a drawstring. Now, the limit on candy is if you get more than this bag, you have to share with the person beside you. These then could be easily stored away in the pockets, ready for the next parade. So we have used our curb cover. We have festivals here. Every small town around has a festival so that there's always a parade. There's always a some kind of a picnic meal, and we can use these at the curb for our parade, and then we can take them over to wherever we're going to have our picnic and join two of them together. The button system that I created, it's in the diagram. It shows you where to attach those buttons on the back side along one edge. So then when you find a loop, then you just join the loops and the buttons. So temporarily you have a large picnic blanket or quilt to use. If kids spill something on it, it won't be the end of the world. This denim has been around a lot. The reason why I didn't construct this as one big piece is it's very heavy. And I didn't want one person to have to carry something so heavy. So I created in two portions, and that way we can have two guys carry our curb cover to the parade route. And my last little thing that I didn't get created was that I was going to roll this up like a bedroll and then just put a strap around each end that you could just sling over your back and carry just like one of those fun camp chairs. So that's the curb cover.
Perfect. You know what that reminded me of is what you can wrap around a yoga mat, a little elastic. So maybe you can grab one of those.
Exactly.
Hi, it's Kathy the Crafty Chica here for Craftsy to show you how to upcycle your cookie, cracker, cereal boxes into these cute little note holders. They also work great as little doodle pads, sketchbooks, whatever you want to call them. You can make a bundle of them to sell, to raise money, to buy more craft supplies, or to give as gifts. Okay, let's get started. You're going to need an empty box, small or large. You can make your little note holders according to the size of your box. Some glue, a little embossing tool, a paper cutter, some scissors, and any excess paper that you have not used in a long time. I always end up with extra orange paper, so I decided to use that for my notepad here. So what we're doing is we're going to take the box and we're going to open it on the seams to lay it out flat. And you can already start seeing where we can cut the spaces to create these notepads. We're looking for a vertical type of shape, which works perfect with these boxes. For this one, I am cutting the top of it off, and it's okay if it's a little crooked because that's where our paper trimmer comes in handy. Cut a little bit off of the ends so that they're all nice and even. You can use specifics to measure everything out, or you can kind of eyeball it. Check out the written directions that I put together for this project to see the exact measurements. I love to make these in all different sizes, and I do just kind of eyeball it, but for this one, I wrote down the specific sizes. So we have a 9.5 inch piece of the box board, which is also like chipboard. And I'm going to go in here and I'm going to score 1 inch. This is going to be a fold that I lift up that will hold the paper. The nice thing about using these boxes is if you mess up, there's plenty more to be found. This works so good for any kind of paper crafting where you need some kind of substance. You can cover it with paper or even fabric. I'll show you at the end of the video how I use some fabric. So what I did here was I measured 4.5 inches from the top of the fold and I scored it once. And then I gave it another score 1 millimeter up just to give it a nice little hinge at the top so that it would close smoothly. And you want to crease both of those scores. And now I'm going to start decorating the front. Now I could choose to cover the whole thing with scrapbook paper, but I just love the element of using these found objects so that I feel like the labels give it some character. So I went into my scrapbook. This piece of scrapbook paper is actually the front cover. So I didn't even use a piece of scrapbook paper. I'm reusing the cover. That's less waste to throw away. I save all of my glitter scraps. I have a box of all of them just to add little pops of sparkle. Here is my double-sided adhesive foam. I save all of my leftovers for that for projects just like this. I took a picture that I had. I also have a little baggie full of all kinds of different pictures that I can use on my projects. And these little leftover pieces of foam core just worked perfect. So save those scraps because you can reuse them. And I just set this all on the back of the picture. And I'm just going to peel away the backing and I'm going to set it front and center of the front flap of the little note holder. And keep in mind, I ended up having to move this up just a tiny bit so that it would still show when I close the book. I'll show you at the end. So now I'm cutting up that orange paper that I have. This is such a great way to make use of this excess paper. I always end up with extra orange, so this is a good way to use it. So now I open the bottom flap and I put a little line of glue and some skinny ribbon because this is what's going to hold that bottom flap in place. It will allow the paper to slide in and stay in there nice and comfortably without falling out. It won't get stuck or anything. And it just also adds another nice design element to the finished project. This piece of ribbon is about 16 inches. So I just wrapped it around a few times and then I glued it on the back. I glued the ends together so that it would be secure. You could even tuck it underneath and glue it. I just glued it on top. For this, you could use some skinny twine, any kind of ribbon, just something that's very easy to wrap around and easy to glue. And once you glue that down, you want to let it set a few minutes so that it's nice and dry. And you can see this is ready to be filled with the paper. So I'm just going to insert as many sheets as I can put in so that it will close nicely. And this is such a cute way to do some little doodles. You can do your doodles in this little notepad and store them in there as well. You could fill them up with little affirmations and give them away. I think these are so great to sell if you do craft fairs or anything like that. A little goes a long way with this project. Now this one I used fabric. I did the same thing. I used the same box except I covered it with fabric inside and out, and I added a little applique on the front and some glittered trim, and I just love this one's a little bit smaller. I love how this one turned out. You could use these to hold artist trading cards to give out, or business cards, or little drawings as random acts of kindness. And it's such a great way to upcycle those boxes that are in your pantry and use your leftover craft supplies. Thanks, guys. I hope you love this project. Let me know if you make it.
Welcome to our live sewing event. I'm Brenda K.V. Anderson, and today I am going to teach you how to make the woolly mittens. So this is what they look like. Let's just do a little show and tell here. These mittens that I designed are made with repurposed sweaters, so wool or cashmere or alpaca sweaters, and felted, and then you cut the fabric out of the felted fabric and sew them together. And they feature this really nice little area for your finger to stick out. So you can do texting outside when you are freezing, right? So you can keep your hands nice and warm. You don't get cold. So first, let's talk about how to get these sweaters. Okay, so what I did was I just went shopping at the thrift stores, went to the Goodwill, and went searching through the the sweater racks. And here's a tip: go to the biggest size first because you get the most yardage, right? The most bang for your buck. Or maybe you're lucky enough or unlucky enough to have accidentally washed one of your sweaters, one of your wool sweaters, and it shrank and it doesn't fit anymore, or you know somebody who has, or if you had a little moth problem and there were some holes in the sweater and you don't want to repair it. There are lots of different places to get these sweaters from. And I love it because you are basically saving these things from the landfill and making something really beautiful out of it. So when you're shopping at the store, if you decide to go to the store, or if you're looking through your closet, make sure that you are getting sweaters that are 100% or like 98% at least wool or alpaca or cashmere or something that is going to felt. It make sure you look at the care label, and if it says something like machine wash, it won't felt, and you won't be able to use those kinds of sweaters. It probably will say hand wash or dry clean only or something like that on the label. So once you find your sweaters, and probably you can get a pair of mittens out of one. I mean, it really depends on what you find, but probably you can get a pair of mittens out of one sweater. But sometimes you'll have sweaters that shrink a lot in the laundry. Like this sweater right here. This is a women's size medium. Obviously it's missing the arms because I cut those off and used them in one of my projects. But I just wanted to give you an idea how much things can shrink in the washing machine. So, and you don't really have a ton of control over how much it shrinks. You can keep checking in the wash as you go, so you can stop it before it gets too tiny to use, but I would recommend getting at least 2 sweaters just so that you know for sure you're going to have enough yardage. So as far as the felting procedure goes, if you've never felted before, it's super easy. You just have to put your sweaters in the wash. If there's zippers on them, just cut the zippers off. Don't worry about things unraveling. They shouldn't unravel unless it's a really, really loose knit or something. And then you just toss them in the wash and wash them on hot. Do exactly what you're not supposed to do to these sweaters to get them to shrink up. And you can put detergent in if you want. You don't have to. To me, it made no difference. I did this many, many times, and it doesn't seem to really make a difference. So if you're washing something else along with it, which actually you should, if you're having trouble with it agitating enough to get your fabric to felt enough, you can throw some old jeans in there and make them agitate. The most, when wool is in the washing machine, the warmth of it, the heat, and also the water, and also the act of friction, the pieces rubbing against each other in the wash, that is what's going to make all the little scales on the wool start clinging to each other and getting tighter and tighter and making it felt. And when you're felting these, you're going to felt them until you can either no longer see any of the stitches. You should not be able to see like the little separate knit stitches, or sometimes it won't felt that far. And like, for example, I don't know if you can see this on the camera, but I can still see the stitches a little bit. Actually, maybe here's a better example. Here we go. You can see that there's texture ribbing here. There's these little stripes in it. You can still see the stitches somewhat, but they have been felted enough that they're not going to unravel. And the way that you know that if you just make a tiny little cut with your scissors and try to unravel it and it doesn't unravel, then you're good to go. If you are planning on ever washing these mittens in the washing machine to clean them, then you need to felt them until they do not shrink anymore. Like, you can map out a little square and wash it and wash it. You can use safety pins to measure out, 4 by 4 inch square or something like that. When it's getting close to the end of felting, and after it stops shrinking, then that will be the point at which you'd be able to machine wash these mittens, because it's not really going to shrink much more than that, or if any at all. Otherwise, you can just hand wash them, or just spot clean them if you need to. So once you have felted your fabric, you can either let it air dry, you can also throw it in the dryer if you want to, and actually the dryer, going back and forth between the washer and the dryer a few times, can help felt things a little faster sometimes. It just depends on the fiber and the way it was made. It's not a one-size-fits-all instructions here, really. You just have to experiment and then felt it enough, wash it enough times until it no longer frays. But once you're done, you can just let it air dry, or you can throw it in the dryer. You can also steam it with an iron. Don't put the iron actually on it. Like, if it comes out very wrinkly, you can steam it with an iron up above and just sort of pad all the wrinkles out. That works just fine. So you'll get your yardage or your sweaters, and you can cut along some of the seam lines to open up the arms, like cut along the underarm seam of the sweater, cut along the side seams if there are any, to give yourself just one layer to work with, because sometimes it can get really thick. Then you are going to, you'll need to print out your pattern. So there are instructions in your pattern that will explain to you what percentage to print it out to. So it depends on the size that you're making. So make sure that when you're printing it, you go to the little box and click, the correct, you have to type the correct percentage that you need for the correct size. If you just print this out straight without altering the percentage that it prints out at, it will print out at a women's medium. So that will be like the standard size. If you just print it out, it should be that. And once you print it out, take a look at this little pattern here. I know that sometimes it can be frustrating, because sometimes printers will just seemingly decide to sort of scale it a little bit to make it fit on the page or have a border or things like that. And I wanted to have a way so that you can check and make sure that it's the correct size before you actually cut your fabric out. So I drew this little red line on the pattern. So if you measure that from one point to the other and check down here for the correct size, it'll tell you if it printed out to the correct size. So once you get your pattern printed out, you can cut all the pieces out. when you have pattern pieces like this with that little box, you're going to cut that box out. Also this is called the finger exit piece. You're going to cut that box out as well because we're going to use that to mark our pieces. So what I use when I am working with something that is thick and it's not going to show through and it's somewhat fuzzy, I oftentimes will use Sharpies to mark those things because a lot of times the normal things that we use to mark our fabrics don't actually work very well. Some fabric markers will work okay on the lighter colored things, but I don't know about you, but when I went to the store, I found almost all gray sweaters. There were like a million wool gray sweaters, and it was hard for me to find a lot of colors. So, if you find something that's dark, I wanted to make sure that you knew you could use a silver Sharpie to mark the dark things. So, let's see, I've already marked my pieces, and in the pattern, I mentioned you can either clip where your notches are here, do a little tiny clip so that you know where your notches are, or you can mark those with the Sharpie if you'd rather. Just make sure you don't clip into past where the seam allowance would be. So here's the little finger exit piece. I'm just gonna show you how I mark this with the Sharpie. Just trace inside that box, like that. And there you have it, your little marking. So you'll cut out all of your pieces and you're gonna make sure that you have, right now what I'm showing you here, what I have is the mate to this mitten. So I cut out both sides of my mitten already and I made one mitten so we could refer to that. And then these are all the parts that we need for the second mitten, okay? So for each pair of mittens, you need to have 2 of the backs of the hands, 2 of the linings of the backs of the hands, okay? So that's gonna go on the inside of your mitten. 2 of the palms of the hands and 2 of the linings of the palms of the hands. You're going to have 2 finger exit pieces. There's no lining for that. And you're going to have 2 heel of the hands for the outside and 2 lining pieces for the heel of the hands. Then there's also a little note on your pattern explaining how to cut, or giving you lengths rather, to cut your ribbing to. So on my mittens, the ones that we're making here, these have a nice long folded cuff. I was able to find, I felted up this really nice cashmere sweater that had holes in it. I felt like I rescued it and it's kind of amazing. It's so soft. And it had a turtleneck on it. So I was able to use this very long piece and it still remained extremely stretchy, which was lucky because sometimes after it felts, it doesn't remain so stretchy. So that's what I'm gonna be using on my piece. And so in the little box, I say you should have about, for this particular size, it should be about an 8-inch wide piece of ribbing, but I have more like a 6-inch wide, but that's because I know it'll stretch enough. It's very stretchy. I have made a lot of these and I've found that a lot of the sweaters don't really stretch that much. Here's a piece of ribbing. This is a cuff from another sweater. See how it stretches just a little, like I'm pulling pretty hard? So this, cutting out your ribbing piece, you will want that piece to be a little bit smaller than your mitten, ideally, so that it kind of pulls in here. And the guide that I have listed on the pattern should help you get the correct size, but if you find something like this and you think, oh, I wish it was just a little bit bigger, you can just check it by pulling it into a tube and putting your hand through there to see if it'll stretch enough for your hand to get through. So this is not so much a science for the ribbing, it's a little more of an art. But I wanted to give you some options because sometimes your sweater has a turtleneck, sometimes it doesn't, sometimes it has long cuffs and you can just seam your cuff right here, just cut off part of it. Sometimes you can use the bottom ribbing piece from your sweater. Sometimes it doesn't have any ribbing at all, which is totally fine. You don't have to put any ribbing on these mittens. But if you wanted to, you could just use a piece of the fabric instead. You could just use a piece of maybe one of the stretchier sweaters that you have. You can fold it in half like that to make your own ribbing, as long as it stretches enough to be able to get your hand through. So those are some options for the ribbing. I've got all my pieces cut out and marked already. And enough talk, right? We need some sewing action here. So I'm going to start with the finger exit piece. That's this piece here. And we're going to begin by adding a little bit of elastic along the edge. We're going to be putting it along this edge right here. And we're just going to do that by using a zigzag. So I happen to have a heavy-duty sewing machine, but you don't need to have a heavy-duty sewing machine. I actually developed this pattern and did the prototypes on my mom's old 1960s Elna, which is a sewing machine I love. And it did just fine. It doesn't have a super high clearance here. And, you know, it's a great old metal machine, which is nice, but it isn't necessarily like super heavy duty. So you don't have to have a heavy duty machine. If you do have a machine that has a walking foot though, that would be extra helpful. All right, so I'm gonna put this on a zigzag, kind of like a medium width zigzag. You want your zigzag to go, you know, cover up a lot of the elastic. I'm gonna go back tack a little here. And I like to pull on my elastic just a little bit so it doesn't get stretched out as I'm laying it down. And you can certainly pin this on there if you like. It's just such a small space that I usually just avoid the pins. But if you're newer at sewing, I would recommend giving it at least 1 or 2 pins there. So we're gonna just cut that off here and cut that off there. And it's okay if it curls a little bit. You just don't want it to be stretched out. You don't want it. The whole purpose of this elastic is to keep your piece from stretching out. So then we're going to add that to the outer palm. So that is this piece right here. We're going to put it on the right side of that piece. I have already marked the wrong side of that piece here. And so we are going to place it exactly opposite that, and we'll find that space with our pins. We're going to pin it on with the elastic showing. The elastic was stitched to the wrong side of this fabric. The elastic should be showing and it should be pointing up towards the fingers. Okay, this is your thumb right here. It'll fold up like that later when you're wearing it, just to orient you a little bit. So we're going to poke a pin through here so we can find the other edge of our rectangle that we drew. Where are you? I'm going to move it just a little bit. Oops, wrong way. There we go. So I like to pin along the shorter edges of that to get it in place. And I'm not much of a pinner, but this is one spot on these mittens that you really do have to pin. Otherwise, your hole is not going to match up in the right spot. Okay, so what we're doing here is we're going to draw, basically, well, we're going to stitch a little box right around the edges of this rectangle. So we're going to start here. Whenever you're making something that is like a welt pocket or a bound buttonhole or something like that, and you want to have this nice turned rectangular edge, you should, you know, our tendency is to want to just start at a corner and go to-do. But it's really hard to match up your beginning with your end. So I definitely recommend starting right in the bottom here and stitching across here like that around and matching and meeting up there where you started. Okay. All right, so now I'm going to move, because we're doing this straight stitch here, I'm going to switch my stitch to straight stitch. And before I get to my pin, I'm going to remove it so I don't hit the pin. I know that sometimes people just sew right over their pins, but I have hit too many pins to want to ever do that. So I always pull them out right as I get to them. And one tip, as you're going around the box, when you're doing the short little seam, if you count how many stitches you did, then you can count the next time you go around. Like here I did 6 stitches on the first side. So now I'll do 6 here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And there's our little tail, and we're gonna meet up with that. All right, so there we have first thing is attaching that finger exit piece to the palm, and then we are going to clip into this box, and we're going to clip right along the center, and then we're going to make like a little Y of clipping right into those two corners, and we're going to try to clip all the way to the corner without clipping the corner. If we clip the corner, that's okay. It happens sometimes and you just have to go around again. You just need to go back in and put those stitches in again. So this is really helpful if you have a very sharp pair of scissors. I'm using my favorite scissors, my Ginger Tailor points here, which I use for everything. All right, so we've clipped that little Y in there, and then you can pull on these just to make sure that you didn't actually clip through your thread, because it'll start to unravel. And then you're just going to tuck that in there to make this nice little rectangular hole, right? And it would be great if you did a little steaming here. So you hold your iron above it, don't actually touch it, but hold it above it and a little bit of steam, and you can kind of push it down. Move the iron away, of course, so you don't burn yourself, and then just sort of push that down to make that a nice crisp edge there. Okay, so then the next step is to take your palms and attach them to the heel of the hand. So one thing I forgot to mention is when you're cutting these pieces out, make sure that you put a safety pin in the right side of your fabric if you can't tell the difference between the right side and the wrong side, because otherwise you might end up you might make two left mittens by accident. That would be a bummer. All right, so we're going to match up. We're going to be doing a seam that goes from here around and then over here. So I like to put the fabric that I am easing on top, so it's a little easier to see what you're doing. So there's our notches. We're matching those up. And we're also put a little pin in over here. And this fabric is really forgiving because it's so nice and squishy and woolly. Easing things in is very easy with this type of fabric. So because we're stitching the outer layers have a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and the lining layer has 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Okay, they're the same pattern piece, they just have different amounts of seam allowance, and that is because your lining has to fit inside of your outer piece. All right, so sometimes I like to put a little horizontal, I'll probably be able to see this little notch here, but just in case I can't see it, I'll put a little horizontal pin there, just until I get it lined up under my machine, and then I pull it out. All right, and so now I want to switch it to a narrow zigzag. So the reason that I switch it to a narrow zigzag is because, instead of just a regular zigzag, is because the zigzag would create too much bulk. I don't want to have that much bulk. I think that's even a little too wide. Just barely a zigzag, a whisper of a zigzag. I like to have that little zigging in there just to create just a little bit of stretch, because this fabric is squishy and a little stretchy, and it might get a little stressed when we're turning it. But you definitely don't want to have a wide zig here, because it's going to make a big thick spot where your seam is, and then when you turn it, it's not going to turn very nicely. Like we have some comments or questions. Let me just check in here. Let's see, Irada, is that how you say your name? I'm sorry if I butchered it. Hi, I love that idea, awesome. Yes, it is kind of a feel-good project. And Lisa says, hi, I'm from Little Chute, Wisconsin. I don't know where that is. I mean, I obviously know where Wisconsin is because I live in Minnesota. And hello from Beloit. Hello. Hello, Jean from Shropshire, UK. Cool. And Dawn, hi from Nova Scotia. Hello, Dawn. Hello from Illinois. Oh, let's see. Hello, I have wool fabric. Will that work? Well, you could try it, but the pattern isn't really made for that. It's made to have just a little bit of stretch. If you want to try making this out of a fabric, I would say polar fleece is probably going to be the closest in feel to it, although it won't be wool. But you could definitely try, you could try the wool fabric. I'm assuming it's a woven, but maybe it isn't. Maybe it has a little bit of stretch to it. If it does and it's thicker, that might work. Let's see. And Anya, she loves this, and she's always wanted to make her own mittens. Awesome. Let's see, zigzag width and stitch length, please. Okay, so I would say the width is like probably about 1/8 of an inch, and the length is probably about the same, maybe a little longer. I have my length kind of in the middle of my machine goes from 1 to 4, and it's about in the center of that, about in the middle of that. Okay, so I've got my heel of my hand attached to the palm, and I'm going to do the same thing for the lining piece. And actually, before I do that, I'm going to clip this. This is the only, when we first trace out all these little boxes, we don't want to actually cut this until we put this piece in here for these two pieces, for the palm of the hand and for the finger exit. But this is just the lining, so we can go ahead and clip this because it'll make it a little easier for us later. We don't want to have to cut that later. So I'm doing the same sort of clipping through the center and making that little Y at the two corners to make it, to be able to have a rectangle come through there later. All right, so then I'm going to place my lining piece onto my two lining pieces together. And I'll just pin around, matching my notches. And put one little pin here. All right. And because this is my lining, I want to do a little bit more of a bigger seam allowance. It should be at 3/8 of an inch instead of 1/4 inch. So after you've stitched around those pieces, you can clip right here into that corner. That'll help everything turn nicely. And do the same on this piece too. You just want to be really careful you're not clipping your actual seam. You can test that by just pulling on it, making sure it doesn't come apart. And if you have a lot of seam allowance, or if you're, I should say, you'll have 3/8 of a seam allowance on the lining piece. But if your lining is thick or thickish, then I would trim a little bit off. You know, it just kind of depends on how thick your lining is. I would recommend, unless you have a very heavy-duty machine, to try and find a thinner sweater for the lining pieces, because it'll just make constructing it a lot easier, and you don't really need it to be that thick on the inside and the outside. All right, so the next step is to put the back of the hand onto the palm and the heel of the hand. We're going to do that for both pieces. And I know this is kind of dark, but I'm just pinning, you know, about 1/4, 3/8 of an inch away from the edge here on this mitten, and I'm going to put a pin just, let's see, let me start from this side. This side is like the pinky side of the mitten. And I'm going to put a pin that goes just above where this seam is here. This is the seam between the palm and the heel of the hand. I'm going to put a pin, we'll put a pin here, and then we'll put a pin here to remind us to stop. Because we are going to leave a little opening in the side of the linings for in the side of the lining to be able to turn these mittens right side out later. All right. And we're going to put another pin in here to remind us to stop at this point too. So you need, depending on the size of your mitten, you're going to need probably like 2 or 3, well, I would say 3 inches or maybe even a little more of space where we're going to stop. Okay, so we're going to stitch from here to the bottom, and then we're going to stitch around here too. So we need to have a little hole in this part, just of the lining one, just of the lining part of the mitten. So we're going to start stitching here 3/8 inch seam allowance again, and again on a narrow zig. And I'm going to stop right where the seam is. I'm stopping right where the seam is, where the thumb sticks out. So I stitched along here and stopped at the thumb. And then I'm going to flip the thumb this way and continue on my way. And the reason I'm doing that is because I just don't want the thumb to get stuck in my seam. And it's just, you know, extra layer. There's a lot of layers right there. And if you have felted your sweater so that it's very thick, or if you've purchased it already, kind of thick sweater to begin with, you won't be able to get all that under your sewing machine. So it's okay to go nice and slow when you're doing this, because you want to make sure that you're easing in your fabric and you don't get any tucks. You don't want to have any little tucks caught in your seam. Okay, I've reached my pin, so I'm going to stop there. And then I'm going to continue. You want to make sure that you're starting before you get to that seam from the palm and the heel of the hand where they come together. You want to, because you don't want to have to sew that together later. All right, so we've made it. We've left a gap here, you can see. So we're going to use that for turning our mitten right side out later. Now we're going to sew the back of the hand on the outer layers to the palm and heel of the hand. So the exact same thing, except for this time we can go all the way around. So I'm just going to pin this just like before. And this time when we go around, we have that extra little finger exit piece. So you have to be careful that you're not going to accidentally catch that. And I'll show you when I put it under the machine what I mean. You just have to fold it out of the way a little bit, which is fine. Okay. So this time we are sewing the outer layer, so we have 1/4 inch. Still on the same narrow zig. So one thing that I noticed as I made a lot of these mittens is for some of them, when you felt them enough, it doesn't actually even really matter what the grain line is anymore. I just wanted to mention that in case you're trying to get a pair of mittens out of a sweater and you've felted it enough that you can't really tell the difference between stretching it in any direction. So I would say still try to stick with either cutting out your pieces the same way as each other, just as an extra precaution, like the backs of the hands, maybe you cut both of the backs of the hands out cross grain, and that would be fine. All right, once again, we're gonna stop. Once I get to that area where the thumb is, I'm gonna back tack a little there. And then we're gonna flip the thumb up, and then we're gonna continue on our way. And if this gets too bulky here to get under your machine, you can always flip your mitten over and stitch from this end and go to there. That would work just fine. Because I know some machines don't have as high a clearance under the presser foot, so. And it just depends on how thick your sweaters get. All right. Okay, we clipped our threads. All right, so the next thing we're going to do is we're going to flip our lining so it's right sides out, meaning all of the seam allowances can go to the inside, just like that. And then we are going to put the lining inside of the outer mitten. We're going to slide it into there. And what I like to do is I like to just fold this down a little first. It seems to make it a little bit easier. And it can be kind of awkward to do this, but I just put my hand inside the mitten and then dress it with the outer mitten. You just need to make sure, let me back up here. You need to make sure that the thumb is directly under this thumb. Don't put it in upside down, otherwise you'll have a palm going to the thumb and it'll be a sad day because you're gonna have to rip it out. But it's not the end of the world, right? All right, so I've placed it in there and you're gonna match up your seam allowances with each other. They should match on the two sides. Leave this folded down because we're gonna add the cuff to this part in between these two layers in a minute. So for my cuff, I am doubling my cuff. You don't have to double it. You could just have one layer of a cuff. Like for example, on this mitten, this was just, I cut this off of a sweater cuff and it happened to work perfectly. It's only one layer. So you can just slip that in between the two layers and call it good. But because I'm making this out of a piece of ribbing that I cut out, a piece of the turtleneck, we're going to pick whatever your right side is, and then I'm gonna do a little seam allowance here. The guide that I suggested on how wide to cut it, the seam allowance that I gave you is about 1/4 inch for a seam allowance there. So I'm just gonna stitch right along that edge, 1/4 inch away. And if you're newer to sewing, you should probably pin that. But I find that this sweatery fabric is, you know, it has some stickiness to it because it's fuzzy, so it doesn't slide around too much. It's a really nice project. It's a really nice fabric to use for newer sewers. So I have my seam allowance here, and I'm going to double my cuff. So I'm just going to fold it like this. And I could stitch them together, but I'm just going to stitch them together when I add it into the mitten. If you're newer at sewing, I would take the extra step and just zigzag them together about 1/4 inch away from the edge. Or here's another tip. If you are using a thicker ribbing, if what your sweater had was something a little thicker, this is very thin fabric, so I can easily double this and get everything into the seam. If it's thicker, scoot this down just a little bit and do a zigzag on and off the edge of the lower piece of fabric right here. So you'll zigzag like this, and then when you put this into the bottom of the mitten, into the cuff, you'll see that later, you will stitch right next to it. So you're not actually sewing through 2 layers, you're just sewing through 1 layer right next to that zigging. So there's another little tip, but mine is so thin, I'm just gonna add it right into the mitten as is. All right, so I turned it so my seam allowances are on the inside there. And then I'm going to slip this in between the 2 layers of my mitten. Now, you know, you may have the thought, oh, well, let's line up all the seams, but then you have all this extra bulk there. So I would definitely recommend putting your seam for the cuff, centering it on the underside of the mitten and not putting it on either side where the other seams are. So you're going to want to slide this on, and whatever kind of cuff you make, you want to make sure that the right side of the cuff, the side that you want to see when you look at your mitten like this side right here, this surface is going to be what you see here. It's going to be touching the right side of this mitten here. So I know it's a little confusing because my piece has both sides are the right side, really, the inside and the outside. So this part is probably the most awkward part. You have to just sort of get them all lined up in the right spot. And I stretch this a little and sort of wiggle it a little to make sure that it's evenly distributed. Oh, we have, Dawn says, hi from Nova Scotia. My parents went to Nova Scotia, and the photos that I saw were just amazing, and I definitely want to go there. And actually, I've wanted to go there ever since I watched the PBS special of Anne with an E. Yes, Nova Scotia. Hello from Illinois. Hello from Illinois. Let's see. And what else Eleanor says she loves this and she's really looking forward to more videos. Awesome. So Eleanor or anyone else, if you have suggestions on videos you would like to see, definitely put that in the chat box too, because I would love to know what you guys are interested in. Would fleece work for the lining? Sue, that is a very good question. Yes, you could definitely use fleece for the lining. I particularly like lining, if I'm making a wool mitten on the outside, I like to line it with wool too, because I really like the extra benefit. Well, maybe I should show you this before. I like the extra benefit of the wool instead of the synthetic. You know, if your hands, you know, say you're out sledding with your kids and you're working up a sweat inside there, your sweat will kind of absorb into the wool, and it's antimicrobial, so they won't stink as much as a fleece would, but also it keeps you warmer when wool gets wet. But I'm not saying, I mean, you can definitely use fleece for the lining, and especially if you felt some sweaters up and they're thicker, find like a thinner fleece to use for the lining. All right, so I've got all my layers here. I have my lining layer, and I have both layers of my cuff. Maybe you'll only have one layer of your cuff, just depending on how you do your ribbed cuff. And then I have my outside layer. And I'm going to pin all of them together from the inside here. And you just want to make sure you are matching up. Whoops, I did not do that. You want to make sure you are matching up the seams, or slightly staggering them. If you have a really thick fabric, you can slightly stagger your seams here between your lining fabric and your outer fabric. That's okay. The mitten police is not going to come after you if they're just a tiny bit twisted there. It's not going to show. All right, so I'm getting these pinned up, and then the magic is going to happen after I sew this. That's the most exciting part. All right. So I have my pins on the inside, and I'm going to continue with my narrow zig. Start on a point that is not this bulk of seam. You're going to start somewhere where the seam isn't, maybe on the back of the hand, or that's probably the best place to start because there's no seams there. And you're going to do a quarter inch seam allowance. Make sure that if you're doing what I did and you didn't stitch the two edges of that ribbing together, just make sure that you really do have all of your layers. And this is the part where it's okay to take your time. I mean, really, it's okay to take your time anytime, but I'm just emphasizing it for this because it is kind of bulky and it's a little awkward. Because you just need to go a little bit at a time. And if you come to a really bulky seam, it is absolutely okay to just turn the wheel manually with your own hand and not plow through it if you're worried that it's going to be a little much. Right, so I've made it all the way around. And if you have a lot of bulk here, you can trim a little away. Don't worry too much if it's not the most perfect seam ever, because it really, like I said before, this fabric is so forgiving. All right, here comes the magic part, guys. So we reach into the mitten, and you're just gonna pull your lining out, and you have this crazy two-handed mitten contraption, and you're thinking, Brenda, what did we make? This is crazy. All right, and then you're just gonna, remember that opening we left? We're gonna flip our mitten inside out. Well, really right side out. That's the lining, and we just keep going, stuffing that mitten inside there. And at some point it might get hard to stuff it in there, so you can reach from this side, and if you have a cuff, you can pull on that. Like that, and then you're going to pop this mitten all the way inside. Just make sure it's not twisted around. I don't think that you could really get it twisted in a full revolution, but just take a look, make sure, here's your little finger exit piece and your hole. That needs to be on the same side as this hole. So you're just going to tuck it in there. And you're going to pull your finger exit all the way through your lining, like that. Okay, and then here's my finger. It's inside out. I'm going to tuck my finger down to get it out of the way. Or, not finger, it's a thumb. I'm going to tuck the thumb down just to move it out of the way and get rid of some of the bulk. You can reach in here too and just sort of smooth things out a little bit. You don't want anything to get caught in the seam. So what you're going to do is you can give this a little press if you want to, and then you're going to fold this piece down. So what you'll see is you'll see the elastic once again. We're going to pin that. We're pinning it just to the lining. Try really hard not to get it pinned to the outer piece, which is inside of the lining right now. If you need to, you can take a piece, you can put your hand in there and see if you've pinned it accidentally, but you can also put a piece of paper in between your layers if you're worried about accidentally catching it with your needle and thread, because we are going to hand sew a little part of this. All right, so I like to start at the top. Let's see, I'm gonna move this just a little bit. Looks like we're pulling on that. Hole was getting stretched out a little bit, the hole in the lining, and I didn't like that, so. All right, so we're gonna start by stitching across here and down around the edge, then we're gonna stitch along this part of the finger exit and back up. And we're just stitching, right here we're gonna be stitching to the seam allowance. But then as we go around here, these areas, we are only stitching it to the lining of the mitten. Okay, so we're gonna start right here. We'll just start there, and then we can tuck our thread ends in, and we're just doing a whip stitch. And this does not need to be, you know, State Fair quality work here. It needs to be sturdy. So use a thicker thread, maybe a button thread or something very sturdy. Use your thread doubled up. And, you know, nobody's going to be looking inside your mittens. It just needs to hold things in place. All right. So now we have switched from sewing to the seam allowance to just catching that lining. Just catching the lining. And you can put your fingers inside here from that little opening that we left. So you can feel when your needle is in between those two layers, so you're not accidentally catching the outer fabric. And when you get to the corner here, definitely stitch through that elastic a couple of times. The whole reason this elastic is here is because your finger is going to be going in and out of this little finger exit with all the texting that we all do. And it's going to be putting some stress on that fabric. So I wanted to give it a way to bounce back into shape and to not be distorted and rip out. So do at least two or three, or even more if you want extra credit, stitches through that elastic, because that's going to help anchor it. That's where the stress point really is. And this part just needs to be, you know, your stitches just need to be close enough. I know that's really hard to see on this video, but your stitches need to be just close enough that you can't accidentally get your finger through there by accident. You know, probably like 1/4 of an inch or so would be fine. And again, you know, my fingers are inside of this, making sure that I am not accidentally catching the outer mitten that's hiding in there right now. Okay, we made it to the other end of the elastic, same thing. We want to go through that at least a couple of times. And then we're going to go back up. And Eleanor says, I am a beginner. I really need more videos like this. Awesome, Eleanor. Well, I hopefully will be back doing these. I really enjoy teaching. This is something that's a little newer in my life. I've spent the last over 20 years working in a costume shop. So there isn't, right now because of COVID, there just isn't that much work for that type of work for me anymore. And so I've switched over to doing more teaching, which has been super fun. I've always enjoyed teaching people about all the things that I love to do and talk about incessantly. Sewing and crocheting and all kinds of crafty things. All right, so I made it around to where I started. I even went a little bit extra just to go over my stitches again, and I'm just gonna knot it off here. And then I'll just tuck my ends in, just putting my needle into that thickness there of the seam allowance so that I can clip it and it won't be in the way. There'll be a little bit of extra yarn, extra tail there. All right, so here we have our finger exit piece is all anchored, And then the last step we need to do is we're gonna fold these pieces in towards themselves like that. And we're going to, you can do this, you can certainly do this last seam part right here. You can certainly do that with hand sewing if you're more comfortable with that, because it can be a little bit tricky, especially if your mitten lining is pretty thick. Mine is a little thick, but this will be fine for me to do. I'm just going to zigzag with my sewing machine, where I zig on and then off and then on and then off and then on and then off. The reason I'm going off is so that it won't create quite such a bulky little lump there. So, oh, and I should also mention, I have used my finger, or before you put this together, you should use your finger to shove that mitten, the outer mitten, which is hiding inside here, shove it over to the side, because you do not want to accidentally catch that. See, I can pinch this right here and know that my mitten, my outer mitten is over here, and this is only my lining mitten. So I'm just gonna do a zigzag. I'm gonna make it a little wider because I want to be able to catch that edge. So kind of mid-width there. And you're sewing through 4 layers of fabric right there. So it is kind of thick, but if you go slow, you'll be fine. All right, we'll check and make sure I caught everything. It looks good. So I've zigged this all closed here, and now you can reach into the mitten, or if you're making a smaller pair of these mittens, you might have to have a kid reach in there, or you can just start pushing a dowel on this end to try and push it in from this side. And you can grab the end of the finger of the mitten here and pull it out. And then this part does take a little finessing because it's going to be lumpy and a little weird, so don't be freaked out when you first turn it. You'll need to pull the thumb out, and then you'll need to place the lining thumb inside of this thumb. So you just need to kind of mush it around until it gets into the right spot, and then I like to just put my hand in here and let's see, I'm trying to get my thumb as squished down. There we go. So right now I have 2 fingers inside of the lining of the thumb, and I'm pushing it up inside of that outer thumb to kind of get it into the right place. And kind of moving this around a little to try and get your lining to be in the right spot. All right, so now we have a mate for our other mitt, and we have a nice little texting spot too. So it's easy. The part of the inspiration behind these mitts is, out of necessity, because I was outside a lot this winter, and I have those nice flip-top mittens where you can just flip it open, but then you have to use your other hand to flip it open. And I just wanted to be able to just pop my finger in and out, without using my other hand, and just have one finger out. So like all of my fingers weren't getting cold, just one of them was a little bit. So I hope that you guys enjoy making this project. And if you do complete this project, please post pictures on social media, because I would absolutely love to see what you did. Let me just double check over here and see if there's anything new. Okay, I think I answered all of the questions. So yeah, please definitely post your pictures. I would love to see them. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed teaching you guys.
Hey everyone, thank you so much for joining me. My name is Nikki LaFoyle, and in this video I'm going to show you how to achieve this fabric embellishment technique, which I've been calling the woven window pane because it looks kind of like a window pane with these little different squares of fabric and our binding strips kind of framing it in, and they're woven together. So you get some depth and dimension, and it's a really interesting effect, and bonus that you can use up a lot of these little fabric scraps. So there is a PDF available for you to download. It's just a sort of a guideline, the steps for this technique all bulleted out for you. So you can find that link to download that PDF in the comments. And of course, I'm going to be going through everything with you in this video. And if you're watching live, and if you have any questions, feel free to type those into the comment section and I'll see those, get any questions answered for you. And feel free to just comment on what you might use some of these woven window pane panels to make. Just say hi, where you're watching from, get a conversation going. I'd love to hear from you. So in that download that you can click to download, there's a supplies list, and the supplies are really, there's not a lot for this, and I called it a fabric embellishment technique, but we're really kind of creating a fabric panel from nothing, from scraps. But we do need a base material to build this on. So I like to use a fusible interfacing for this, and you can use kind of whatever you have. It depends a little bit on what you're going to be using this panel for. So I like to use these to make bags, you know, this is one that I'm in process of making into a little zippered pouch. And I really like fusible fleece for that. So fusible fleece, a lightweight interfacing, that's what I've used on this panel here. And if you don't know what you're going to be using this panel for, a lightweight interfacing is a really good place to start because you can always add interfacing to it if you decide you want something a little bit more stable. So you'll need some lightweight interfacing or other fusible material. You could also feasibly use something that's not fusible and do like a temporary spray adhesive or use a glue stick or something like that to stick your pieces down onto it if you're a little scared of using the fusible with your iron in the way that I'm going to show you how I use it. So material to build on, you'll need fabric scraps. So you get to dive into your stash of scraps and use up all these little pieces that you've been saving because you didn't know what you might need it for. This is what you needed it for. So grab those little fabric scraps, and I like to use a lot of different colors because with the way these binding strips kind of break up the squares, you can put these different colors and patterns next to each other, and it's not like clashing because you have something separating them. You could, of course, use a little bit more of a monochromatic scheme if you wanted to. You are the master of your own destiny, as they say. Anything you want, whatever fabric scraps you have. You'll also need some material for these binding strips. I like to use denim for this. I think it gives a really cool texture, and because of the thickness of denim, it gives a little bit of depth as well. But of course you could use whatever you have, cotton. I'm sure that would look really nice as well. And the size that you cut these pieces and these strips, it also depends on how you want it to look. So there's a big difference between my 2.5 inch squares and my 5/8 inch finished binding, and these 1.5 inch squares and my 1/2" binding strips. So it is totally up to you. This is your project, however you want it to look. I wanted to make a couple of different sizes so you could see really how that changes the look of it. So if you're making a smaller project like my little zippered pouch, a smaller square and window pane looks really nice. A larger project, a little bit bigger, looks really nice, but it's totally up to you. Lisa says, I think this would make a super cute throw pillow. I agree. This is a great home deck type panel. Jessie is watching from New Brunswick, Canada. Thank you so much for tuning in. We have Wanda from North Carolina and Yvonne from Michigan. I'm also from Michigan. Hello, Yvonne, fellow Michigander. So to start with, I like to start by cutting my fusible panel roughly the size of the project that I'm going to be making. And the great thing about this is if you don't really know the size that you're going to be making a project from, you can start and then you can also kind of add on panels. Because we're using a fusible, you can kind of add it to the edges and keep making it bigger. So I've cut my fusible piece roughly to the size I think I want it. And here's my fusible fleece. Like I said, there's some loft to it, but it offers a lot of stability and structure while remaining nice and soft. So you want to cut your squares. These are 2.5" squares, and arrange them on your fusible. So I've got the fusible side up, which can be a little nerve-wracking because we're going to be pressing on this side, but you want to arrange your fabric squares so that the raw edges are touching. So in theory, there is no fusible that is showing to get on your iron. But if that makes you nervous, you can also use a piece of parchment paper to press on so that no glue will get on your iron. That is no joke. Nobody wants that. So arrange your fabric pieces, and I just want to make sure my raw edges are touching. And I've aligned the edges of the fabric with the edges of the fusible on the sides as well, as much as I could. There's a little bit, my fabric is hanging off the fusible a little bit on these short ends, which is fine. That just means that my fusible won't be so much in my seam allowances when I stitch this into something, and that's fine with me. So I'm going to finish off arranging my squares. And then we will press this to fuse everything. Sandra from Austria, thank you so much for tuning in from Austria. I could see that panel with the smaller pieces turned into a small purse. Absolutely. I think it creates such a cool visual interest. And you can use all of those beautiful fabrics that you've been collecting that say, kind of are an expression of your personality. Okay, so there is my fabric panel, double checking. There's no fusible. That looks good to me. So we're going to press this, and when you're pressing on your fusible, always, you want to use a pressing motion, not an ironing motion. And especially with this, because it would be so easy for the edges, any of these edges of these little squares to come up. So we're pressing, up and down motion, press down and then lift. And and you want to press follow your manufacturer's instructions for whatever fusible you're using. But I like to press for about 10 seconds in each spot, using a little bit of steam and a hot iron. And over at the edge here, I've got a little bit of fusible showing, so I'm just going to be careful not to press over that and get any glue on my iron. You will also need for this project a glue stick or some double-sided tape, something to stick down your binding strips over these seams before we go to sew it. That is super, super helpful for keeping everything in place. If you're using a lighter weight fabric like a cotton, you might be able to pin it down, but I'm using denim, so I didn't want to have the hassle of trying to pin those layers of denim down through my fusible. So I like to use a glue stick, and it holds everything down really nicely. Holds everything in place, so you don't even have to worry about it. All right, that feels like it is good infused. All right, next we are going to align our binding strips over these raw edges. So you'll need as many binding strips as you have seams for your rows and your columns. So here are my denim binding strips that I just cut from an old pair of jeans. So I cut my strips at 1 1/4 inches wide, and I pressed the raw edges in to meet at the center. So they finish at 5/8 inch wide. I didn't want to take up too much of the fabric. I mean, the fabric, it's the focal point. I didn't want the binding strips to be too wide. I wanted to let that fabric shine. So we're going to start. I like to clip these at the upper edge. So I'm starting, and I'm centering my binding strips over my seams. In both directions. And then we're going to start weaving this together as we glue these down. Hi from the UK, from Jam Pots Misty. I'm really curious about how you will sew down the binding strips, will there be hundreds of ends to tie off? Yes, there'll be lots of ends. And I'm lucky my sewing machine, it has a automatic tie-off button and thread cutter. So because of the way we are going to be stitching this, yes, because we're going to be stopping a lot and jumping over where our woven strips are woven under. So I'll show you how that goes. So I'm just gluing a little bit at a time here because my glue actually dries fairly quickly. So like one seam at a time, or one square at a time. And we want to go over and under. So I went over on that one, so I'm going to go under on this one. And we'll go over on this one. And this glue is just a glue stick of Elmer's washable school glue, but it comes in really handy for a lot of sewing aspects. So this one's going to go over. That piece. And then because we had our strip going over on that one, we're going to go under on this one. And in your PDF that you have downloaded, hopefully, there are some in-progress pictures as well, just to kind of keep you oriented for how we're weaving this. Wanda says, wondered how it would look to let the denim edge fray. That is an excellent idea. Yeah, that would be a totally different look. A little bit more organic. I like that idea. Okay, so we're going over on this one and under on this one. And then over on this one. And before you go to sew this on the machine, double check that you have your weave all correct, because it's not, even with this glue stick, it is not, whoops, and see? I almost did it myself. We'll go under for that one. It's not permanent with this glue stick. It's not permanent until you go to sew it down. So double check that everything is in the correct arrangement. We go under and over. A couple more seams, and then we will take this to the machine and stitch. And the color of thread that you use when you stitch these edges down also can add a decorative effect. So on my small one that I did, I used blue thread so that it would blend in. On this one, I'm going to use a brighter thread. I want to use a gray so that you can see the stitching, and we'll see how we like that effect. And I'm just going to use a straight stitch when I go to stitch this. You could use a different stitch. You could use a decorative stitch. Sky's the limit. Whoops, under. Luckily this glue dries clear. And you do want to make sure you wait until your glue is dry before you go to stitch this. Stitching through wet glue be bad for your needle. Okay, so everything is stitched down. I want to move this a little bit. It looked like it was not quite centered where I wanted it. There, that's better. Okay. Make sure I don't have any questions coming in. Okay. So when we go to stitch this, like I say in the instructions, we're going to stitch the edge of this, and where the strip is woven under, you want to skip over. So this side-to-side strip is going over this vertical strip. So when I stitch this, I'm going to stop here, cut my thread, jump over that, and then stitch again. And where this vertical strip is going over, I'm going to keep stitching and then stop, and so forth. Skip and then jump. So that we are reinforcing this woven look. So I'm going to bring this over to my machine. And I'm going to start, and I'm edge stitching. So I'm going just a scant 1/8 of an inch away from my edge. And I'm coming up to the edge of my next strip. Now you can backstitch a little bit, lock your thread in some way. And I'm actually going to cut my thread because I have an automatic thread cutter. If you don't, you could just lift your needle, lift your presser foot, and just kind of move over and skip that, and then cut your threads after. Okay, and I'm locking that stitch again. And then this is an over section, so we are continuing over. And we're reaching another under section, so lock. And I won't cut that one, I'll just kind of skip over so you can see. It's easy to tie or to cut those threads off after. Locking the start of the next stitch, and then we carry on. So we're going to do this for our over strips, or for our vertical strips, and our horizontal strips. And if you don't have a lock stitch button, you can just do a back stitch or two. So I'll do that for a couple of them. And then at the end of the panel, you will cut that and bring that over. So we've got our stitching on one of our long strips. So I'm going to clip those where I skipped over. Jam Pots Misty asks, would it work if you didn't use the glue? It would. It would work. The glue is just to hold these binding strips down as you are sewing it. You could use pins to hold it in place, or if you were that type of person, you could just trust yourself and kind of hold these in place. You could even clip at the other edges to try and hold those in place, centered over your seams as you're stitching. I'm the kind of person, I like to have everything locked down as it's going under the needle. So it's up to you, but you can see, hopefully you can see my gray thread. So we skipped over this one and then stitched, skipped over that one and then stitched. So I'm going to do one of my sideways ones, and then we'll jump to one that is already a little bit more done, so you can see the finished effect. So you do have to kind of pay attention as you're sewing so you don't accidentally sew over one of your woven under spots. You could also, you could patchwork a panel together if you wanted, and that would kind of eliminate the need for a fusible behind it if you secured all of your little pieces together with seams first. But I didn't want to do that because it just seemed like the seams were all going to add a little bit more bulk under my binding strips, and I knew I wanted to use denim. So I wanted to eliminate as much of that as I could. So again, we skipped over our over spot, so I'm going to stitch the other side of this horizontal one actually. And then we will jump to our finished panel. And I have upped my stitch length a little bit. So my machine defaults to a 2.4 for construction length stitches, and I've bumped it up to a 2.8, which I usually use for top stitching. 2.8, you could go up to a 3. And I like doing that because the stitch is a little more visible. Oh, I ran out of bobbin thread. I've been sewing with air, but you can see the idea. And let's jump to this one. So I've got my stitches going and securing this binding strip down and just hopping over wherever something has crossed over it. So when you're finished sewing all of your vertical and your horizontal strips, you can trim those off of the sides. Trim the extra binding off at the edges. I have a little extra fusible showing on this one, so I'm going to trim that off. And then you can use your panel to create whatever you want, whether that is a little purse, a little zippered pouch, like I'm going to do with this one eventually, tote bag, what have you. Honestly, this is such a cool little panel. You could even, use it as just one little square of it in the center of something and use some plain fabric around it. Use it as, a patch pocket on something. So it is just a cool looking technique. I love the depth that this woven, the woven technique gives to it. And again, you can use it for your scraps. So what's better than that? So Sandy says, I think the stitches would also look good in a classic yellow thread, like some denim jeans are made. Yeah, like a goldy type yellow for that top stitching they use on the flat felled seams on the sides of jeans. That's a great idea. That would look great, a nice little pop of color. I started doing this one in like an orange down here. It's really hard to see. So that's why I switched to the gray, which would be a little bit lighter and a little bit more of a pop. And again, this one was stitched in like a blue denim color thread, so you can't even see the stitching on that one. You just see the binding strip. So a little bit of a different look, but a really fun panel that you wind up with to then use in your creative projects. So thank you so much for tuning in and watching the video. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you enjoy this technique, and make yourself a woven window pane panel to use in a creative project in the future. Thanks again, and have a great day.